So I'm sharing this because, well, I'm genuinely starting to question my own sanity. My spouse and I purchased an old timber homestead in the rural backcountry of Connecticut roughly 4 years ago. It's one of those historical properties that has undergone just enough modernization to mask its age, but it still retains its original late 1800s framework. For the first few seasons, the place was pretty good too. There wasn't even a structural creak. But everything shifted about 8 months ago when we brought our newborn son home from the hospital. Now, I'm well aware that chronic sleep deprivation can cause your mind to play really severe tricks on you, but the occurrences inside this house have become far too consistent to be just dismissed as a lack of rest. It all began with vocal mimicry. So my partner spends a lot of time working out of the detached equipment shed, and he recently came into the kitchen looking incredibly agitated, asking why I had been shouting for assistance from the second floor landing. I had been downstairs with our child, though, the entire afternoon in absolute silence. Then, a couple of weeks later, I was in the midst of taking a shower when I distinctly heard him step into the bathroom space, stating, "Hey, I'm running down to the gas station," and click the door shut. When I stepped out into the hall, his truck was gone, but upon asking him later, he had actually departed 20 minutes prior to that moment. The physical layout of the building seems to amplify this thing too. There's a secondary narrow stairwell near the kitchen that was originally built for domestic stuff, and that specific quadrant of the house always carries a sort of heavy and suffocating pressure to it. Last month, I was sitting on the rocking chair in the nursery, which is situated directly at the apex of those rear stairs, trying to get our son to drop off to sleep. It was during that dead frozen window right around 2 a.m, and our son was beginning to sort of drift off when his entire body went completely rigid. He didn't look toward the open hallway either. His eyes locked directly onto the floorboards in the absolute center of the room. I followed his gaze and watched the woven rug that we have in the middle of the nursery visibly compress. It wasn't an abrupt indentation or anything, exactly as if a heavy individual was slowly shifting their physical weight from one foot to the other while standing directly in front of the crib. I could hear the old pine joist groaning beneath the weight of this invisible mass, too. I desperately tried to rationalize it as the framing settling due to the night drop in the temperature, but then our smart nursery monitor captured something that genuinely made me physically ill. It's a high-end unit equipped with automated motion tracking lenses, and while I was downstairs preparing a bottle, my phone buzzed with an alert, "Unusual activity detected in nursery." I opened the live feed. The motorized camera was slowly panning in a smooth arc. It wasn't centering on our son, though. It was systematically tracking something invisible that was walking in a flawless but deliberate circle around the exact perimeter of the crib. The terrifying part wasn't just the mechanical movement of the lens, though. It was the audio feed. The speaker picked up a wet and rapid clicking sound. It sounded just completely alien. The moment that the camera tracking path passed over the top of the crib, our son's fine hair visibly ruffled and shifted too, moved by, well, I don't know. The absolute peak of the activity, though, occurred 3 nights ago when I was standing at the kitchen counter and I heard my spouse's voice emanate from the other side of the basement door. It wasn't a loud shout. It was a sort of dry and raspy whisper pressed directly against the wooden grain, and it said, "Can you turn the handle from out there? The latch seems to be jammed." My partner, though, was sitting directly next to me in the living room sofa when this happened, and we both heard the words with absolute clarity. He grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat, threw the basement door open, and shone the beam down the steps. But the stairwell was completely empty. He went down there and checked it out, but he never found anyone. We've now reached a point where neither of us will step foot near the basement levels after sunset, and we've permanently moved our son's bassinet into our master bedroom too. It feels as though the structure completely ignored our presence, though, until there was a brand new life inside of it to react to, which is really weird, I know. But has anyone experienced this type of mimicry before following a birth? It's really unsettling, as you can probably imagine, and frankly, it feels incredibly malicious that it's utilizing our own voices to try to manipulate our movements through the dark parts of the house at night. I've been living in university-affiliated student apartments in Sheffield for about 8 months now. It's one of those uninspired, late 1980s concrete blocks that constantly retains a damp chill and smells perpetually of heavy-duty industrial cleaner. Last weekend, my 2 flatmates travelled down to Bristol for a family anniversary, leaving me completely solo in our shared multi-bed unit for the very first time. I'm generally not the type to get nervous in an empty space, but there's a specific, heavy kind of quiet that drops over those institutional corridors on a late weekend night that really unsettles me. Anyway, I turned in around midnight, switched off my desk lamp, and was beginning to lose consciousness when the noise began. It was a slow, deliberate, mechanical grinding, it sounded like. Actually, it sounded exactly like somebody scraping a rusted iron file across something metal. My muscles went completely rigid, and my mind shifted into that hypervigilant state where your own pulse starts echoing in your ears. The friction was originating from the center of the floorboards, right near our shared metal storage lockers. I sat upright, chest tightening, and fumbled on the nightstand for my mobile to switch on the camera flash. The scraping didn't cease the instant that the light hit the space. I swept the beam directly across the steel locker panels, and this grinding persisted for roughly 4 seconds, I would say, while I was staring right at the metal. Then, with a sharp click, it stopped entirely. Feeling a little bit foolish, I stepped out onto the cold floor and conducted a bit of a systematic sweep. I checked beneath the vacant bed frames, opened the lockers, and inspected the gap behind the radiator unit. But the space, it was completely bare. I eventually managed to rationalize the noise as a localized water hammer or an air pocket trapped in the old heating infrastructure, and I climbed back beneath the blankets. I must have dropped into a light sleep too, because I remember snapping awake suddenly again, roughly 2 hours later. The mechanical friction, it had returned, but the volume was really muted now. But then, I began to distinguish between 2 distinct vocal tracks. They weren't shouting, it was a sort of rapid overlapping whispering, coming from the foot of my mattress frame. The cadence belonged to 2 individuals, I would say, and one possessed a high, breathless pitch, while the second voice had a dry and really deep and raspy sound to it. They seemed to be communicating simultaneously, their words firing so rapidly that it sounded a bit like a cassette tape being fast-forwarded. The most disturbing element of the event, though, was that while the vocal track was active, my brain translated every single syllable with, perfect clarity. They were hostile as well, from what I could make out. At first, they were discussing how congested the layout had become, and expressing intense resentment that our belongings were occupying their square footage. It didn't carry a typical cinematic presence or anything. It felt exactly like being cornered and berated by 2 highly aggressive, tangible individuals standing less than an arm's length from my feet. And then they began talking about getting rid of me. I remained completely motionless beneath the duvet, refusing to even shift my posture. Then, as instantaneously as it had begun, the vocal tracks just vanished. The ambient weight in the room immediately lifted, and it felt empty again. The next morning, I went to clear my breakfast dishes in the communal kitchenette at the end of the hall, and while cleaning the counter, I noticed a deep, fresh circular indentation in the heavy flooring right where the foot of my bed sat on the other side of the partition wall. Also, the backing material had been, crushed down. In fact, it was so crushed that it split the synthetic surface, exposing the raw, grey concrete subfloor beneath it. And I don't remember it being that way before then. My flatmates returned late Sunday afternoon, though, and the standard routine resumed. However, since that weekend, both of them have independently begun complaining of, a persistent sound or hum that they keep hearing. They both claim that they can detect, a faint frequency ringing in the corners of the room whenever the apartment falls silent. I personally haven't disclosed a single detail of what I experienced during their absence yet. I'm simply keeping my head down and just counting the weeks until the term concludes so that I can sign a lease on some other place. I've been debating whether or not to share this because, well, the more distance that I get from the event, the more my rational side tries to persuade me that I simply experienced a bizarre episode of sleep paralysis or something like that. but I just cannot rationalize my dog's physical reaction, and that is the specific detail that keeps me from putting it out of my mind. So, this occurred roughly 3 months ago at my family's residence in a rugged, wooded sector of eastern Tennessee. It was a standard weekend, and the house was completely silent. My stepfather was working a late shift at the regional shipping hub, and my younger brother had turned in early because he had an early morning cross-country meet. I distinctly recall being cautious not to creak the pine flooring near his doorway when I walked down to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The initial indicator that the environment had shifted was our blue heeler, Buster. He is generally a high stoic animal, but I caught the sound of him on the enclosed sunroom making this low, sort of vibrating growl. A warning sign that he reserves for large predators on the property line, really. I stepped out onto the floor to pull him back inside, and he was completely pancaked against the floorboards, his hackles raised fully, baring his teeth at the dense foliage near our northern boundary line. I directed my gaze toward the spot that he was tracking. There was no moonlight that evening, so it made the whole space pretty much a solid wall of blackness. But there was a singular pocket near an old cedar trunk that appeared noticeably darker and more solid than the surrounding night. I initially assumed that it was a discarded tractor tarp or maybe a shifting shadow, but then the mass adjusted its posture. This thing was easily 7 feet in height. The upper torso was immensely broad as well and squared off, yet the lower frame was really emaciated, with the upper limbs extending down well past the joints where the knees should have been. Then, 2 lights sort of snapped into view. They weren't reflecting the ambient glow of the sunroom fixture. They were self-contained. They were spheres. Just 2 static, burning spheres looking directly at our position. Buster immediately retreated beneath a heavy iron workbench, and I completely locked up. I was unable to move, and this thing suddenly moved, and then the spheres just vanished or were extinguished, and that physical mass of shadow dissolved into the surrounding darkness. There wasn't even an outline anymore. I waited a beat, and then I sort of detected a fluid ripple tracking along the gravel driveway, like a pool of dark oil sliding across the stones. It was moving directly toward the perimeter of our house. I retreated into the main house, and I secured the heavy sliding glass frame as quietly as I could. I stood in the unlit kitchen, my heart basically jumping out of my throat. I attempted to call my stepfather, but I just couldn't get a signal. That was the moment, too, that whatever this thing was, it began circling the house. I was standing near the counter, and suddenly those spheres were back, too. They were lingering at one of the windows, and it almost felt like they were trying to peer in. The exact second that I adjusted my head to get a direct line of sight with these things, they would click off like a light bulb, and just would vanish. A minute later, that exact same sort of lighting would manifest in the narrow window flanking the utility room, and it seemed to be sort of inspecting every single external access point, yet it never made physical contact with the glass frames or anything. Also, as odd as it was, there was no vibration, no scratching, nothing coming from these lights. There was no sound at all. The most disturbing occurrence, though, that took place near the main hallway mirror. So I was walking down the corridor to verify that my brother's door was secure as well, and as I passed the mirror, I caught the reflection of the rear living room window behind me, and I saw those spheres clearly visible inside of that reflection, hovering static in the dead center of the pane. But when I spun around to confront the actual physical window, the glass was completely vacant. But I could still see them in the mirror. It was like they were visible in the reflection, but not if you looked directly at them. Whatever these things were, they maintained this precise sort of circuit for nearly 45 minutes too, appearing and disappearing at separate window frames, steadily shifting its orientation toward the driveway. The final moment that I saw them, that silhouette again, the dark one, was standing directly over my stepfather's empty parking space. The spheres, they flashed once, remained illuminated for roughly 5 seconds, and then everything just went completely dark. And after that, I didn't see or hear anything for the rest of the night. When I went out to inspect the driveway the following afternoon, I noticed something a little weird where the shape had been standing. There was a really sort of dark patch there, almost like when you look at an oil spill on a brand new driveway. It had that sort of coloration to it, and I know that it wasn't there before. When my stepfather finally drove onto the property at 3:15 a.m. the next night, well, everything had completely normalized. Buster was normal again. He came out from beneath the workbench, and the yard returned to its standard state. I felt completely absurd, attempting to explain the sequence of the events to him the following morning. And I'm completely aware that without some photos, or something at least, it simply sounds like an episode of just, well, sleep-induced tracking errors in the dark or something. But personally, I no longer think that this place is empty. I also cannot stop thinking about the fact that, whatever that thing was, it didn't walk like a human. It simply slid between the shadows and moved like it was levitating. I stopped my late-night visits to the gym at a place in Salt Lake City, Utah, about 5 months ago. I still haven't gathered the necessary composure to terminate the contract in person, opting entirely for home-based training regimes instead. The situation began with a guy that I internally designated as the Sentinel. He was consistently present when I checked in at around 11:30 p.m., a guy in his late 50s, constantly dressed in heavy steel-toed leather boots and a reflective safety vest over a stained canvas jacket. He never used any of the exercise machinery. He just occupied the central weight benches and monitored the main entrance, it seemed. He maintained an unsettling routine of wiping down a pair of vintage field binoculars with his sleeve while watching people utilize the cardio equipment. One evening, he blocked my path near the drinking station. Speaking in a dry, wheezing whisper, he asked if I could assist him in deciphering the small text on the reverse side of an electrolyte canister, claiming that he had left his glasses in his vehicle. As I bent over to read the label, his focus remained entirely off of the package. He leaned his torso forward, distinctively inhaled the scent of my neck, and then muttered, "You smell like blood." I immediately retreated, but before I could process the interaction, he produced an old analog instant print camera and took a shot of me directly in my face. He didn't request permission. He simply watched the physical print slowly colorize while maintaining a wide, rigid smile. I abandoned the remainder of my training routine at that point. I got my gear from the benches, and I left the changing rooms pretty much instantaneously. When I cleared the turnstile, though, he was positioned directly beside the glass exit doors. He remained completely mute, but he was holding the picture of me in front of me, almost tauntingly as I left. I broke into a fast walk toward my car at that point, which was about 2 blocks away due to some active and ongoing roadworks. But then I heard something. The distinct sounds of feet hitting the pavement from behind me. He wasn't sprinting, but he was definitely keeping pace with me. I quickly diverted into an old night diner just to establish a presence under active lighting and surveilling the area. I waited there for roughly 15 minutes too, purchased a drink, and then I eventually left full sprint across the remaining block to my car. At first, I assumed that this had worked as well, until I arrived at my house. I occupied a ground-level unit, and it had a sliding glass entrance that looked out toward the secondary access road. As I got inside and locked the door from behind me, I glanced through the glass, and that's when I caught the immediate reflection of that high-visibility safety vest. It was actually in the glare of the glass, but I know that I saw it. He was stationed, entirely motionless, on the walkway, and he seemed to be taking more photos. After taking those photos, though, he just stood up and he walked away. Every morning for the next week, I would always find something deposited on my exterior patio furniture. They weren't like standard tokens of harassment or anything. That would be too obvious. There were things like dried bugs or piles of leaves perfectly stacked. Things like this. There were dozens of them too, systematically put there in small squares. There was no accompanying messages or anything like that, just these things. I ultimately contacted the police, but because technically he had just been on the walkway and taking photos, there really wasn't much that they could do. They did say that they would increase some patrols around the area, but again, not much that they could do. Eventually, though, I packed my belongings and broke my lease to relocate to an apartment on the opposite side of the metro area about 3 weeks later. But during my final morning there, clearing out of the old unit, I discovered one final thing beneath the rubber blades of my windscreen wipers. It was a single silicone earplug. Well, that's what I thought it was at first, but that's when I noticed that it was actually one of my headphones that I had misplaced inside of the gym a full month prior. The small piece of blue silicone now trapped under the windscreen wiper. I took it out from under the windscreen wipers and, like I said, I moved, but I also quit the gym and I never went back there again. So I've logged thousands of miles on heavy long-haul transport routes between the interior plains and the southern coast, and I am well acquainted with that standard highway trance where the asphalt sort of simply dissolves into a continuous blur. However, the sequence of events that my partner and I encountered 2 winters ago was not an optical illusion. We're both highly practical people, technically minded individuals. She's an industrial logistics analyst, and I work as a commercial refrigeration mechanic. Our entire careers rely on fluid dynamics, pressure readouts, and objective logic. We were transporting our equipment in a pretty heavy-duty vehicle, a vehicle that consumes diesel at a pretty predictable and aggressive rate. We were heading toward an overnight layover. Right around 9:30, the navigation system diverted us off of the highway onto a series of unsealed state roads that weren't merely remote, they felt completely prehistoric. We had been ascending a steep ridge and navigating winding, unpaved terrain for nearly 90 minutes, I would say, and yet the fuel gauge remained fixed precisely at 65%. It didn't fluctuate even a millimeter. Even the onboard computer's digital range remaining calculation stayed completely frozen. It was exactly as if the vehicle was tracking across a map grid, but it was like we weren't losing any fuel or anything. Then, the homesteads began exhibiting, well, bizarre behavior. We noticed that every property that we had passed was totally devoid of any light. No security lanterns, no internal lights, nothing but cold iron and timber. My partner remarked with dry irony, "Watch the next one light up like a football stadium." And sure enough, we rounded a sharp curve and encountered a small cottage with every single external fixture, including 3 floodlights and an overhead workshop bar, blazing intensely into the dark. Which was really weird because it almost felt like the environment or something was actively processing our conversation in real time, instantly generating whatever concept we specified. The oncoming traffic, though, was the absolute weirdest. After driving for maybe 30 miles without encountering a single vehicle, we passed a cluster of 3 identical white sedans traveling in a really rigid and perfectly staggered convoy. It resembled almost like a stunt formation if you've ever seen one. And exactly 15 minutes later, we passed the identical 3 white sedans again, traveling in the exact same direction. They maintained the same distance apart, the same faded paint trim, and the same missing hubcaps on the rear wheels. There were absolutely no junctions, access tracks, or turnoffs where those vehicles could have looped back to pass us twice like that. It was like we were seeing things twice. The lack of life, though, was suffocating in this place too. I track game regularly, so my eyes are always scanning the shoulders for livestock or things of this nature. And for nearly 60 miles, there wasn't even as much as a single moth hitting the windscreen. No livestock, no chickens, no birds, I mean, nothing. The only thing out there that we encountered was a coyote standing motionless in a drainage ditch. Weirdly too, it didn't startle or flinch when our large engine rumbled past. It just stood there, rigid, staring straight ahead with tiny dull eyes that completely failed to reflect our high beams. And I know that this is going to sound a little bit weird, but it almost looked like a low-resolution physical model that just hadn't finished forming. That's really the best way that I can describe it. Our old dog, though, who is typically an immovable fixture in the cabin, was now trembling violently under the rear bench. He was clearly terrified by something. Then we had a vehicle behind us trail us for, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 miles. A set of headlights maybe 5 meters away from our rear tray, which was super dangerous too. My partner kept monitoring the side view mirrors, her face draining of color more and more, and she then informed me that the lights were not from a vehicle, but they were, well, morphing is what she said. 1 second they were wide, rectangular lenses of a vintage commercial flatbed, and the next they were like 2 rounded spheres moving exactly in the same way. The physical shapes would also flicker and alter their configuration at times. But the instant that our tires hit the off-ramp back onto the main highway, the entire environment just completely changed. The fuel needle literally plummeted instantly to just below a quarter of a tank. The digital clock on the dashboard skipped forward exactly 1 hour and 14 minutes, and my partner's phone lit up with urgent notifications. Apparently, her brother had attempted to contact her 5 times within that hour, stating that he had experienced a really weird and overwhelming panic that something was wrong. Thankfully, we got to our destination in one piece, but man, that was a really weird night. We completely avoid those back roads these days, and I don't care how many minutes I might save if I were to take it. It's just not worth it. I don't know how to explain what happened that night. I don't know where all that time went, but whatever the case was, I won't be going back there. So I was awake well past midnight at the dining table, organizing a complex set of inventory spreadsheets to decompress after a shift and just get some work done. The place was completely silent, except for our chest freezer. My partner had drifted off on the armchair in the adjacent lounge. I could see them because of the TV screen's light. I wasn't looking directly at the lounge too when something happened. I was looking into the polished glass of the entryway display cabinet, which provides a direct angle reflection of the seating area, and in the reflection, I watched a towering, emaciated black shadow emerge from the recess of the linen cupboard, not stepping through the door, but appearing to unfold directly out of the timber framing of the wall cavity itself. Now, it did not look human at all. It didn't even move that way. The form was easily 8 feet tall, with skeleton limbs that were completely disproportionate to its torso. It positioned itself directly over my sleeping partner, bending its upper frame forward until its facial plane, if that's what you can call it, was less than 2 inches from their forehead. I went completely rigid. I was entirely alert and hyper-focused on this thing too. This thing then pivoted its upper torso toward the dining room, immediately noticing me. It didn't have any eyes, and there were just these 2 deep, non-reflective, matte black cavities where I should have been. I then heard in my head, "This one is marked." Then, a raw, protective panic overrode my paralysis, or whatever it was. I stood up from the table, strode directly to the threshold of the lounge room, and shouted, "No, they aren't. Get out of here." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my pocket knife and started thrusting it forward to try to assert myself. The reaction was immediate too. This thing just suddenly compressed into a ball of shadow and literally dropped straight through the floorboards. Our old terrier, who typically flees from loud noises, lunged into the center of the room. And then suddenly, this ball of shadow came back through the floor, came straight towards him in a beeline, and went straight through the dog. Our terrier let out a sharp yelp when that happened, and seemed to be physically thrown backward by it, his head twisting to the side. He scrambled up immediately, his eyes trying to track this thing. I grabbed a heavy iron fire poker nearby, the nearest solid object within reach, and I began swinging this metal thing through the empty space and screamed for this thing to leave. A fraction of a second later, this weird concussive sound reverberated through the framework of the entire house. The heavy steel door of our upright pantry buckled inward a little bit, and the metal shelving brackets inside literally sheared off the walls, sending everything in it crashing down and just breaking everywhere. Both of our dogs were now tracking the ceiling as well, their heckles raised and growling the entire time. After a moment of watching them do that, everything went quiet. My partner obviously woke up with all the noise, and I had to explain to him everything that happened. During the cleanup of the pantry later that morning, I think I discovered the source of that weird concussive reverberating. One of the heavy iron bolts driven deep into the framework behind the plaster, during the home's original construction I think, had been violently pulled out of the wood. What I mean is that it hadn't just sort of like vibrated loose and it was loose to begin with or anything. It had completely pulled out timber and all with it. After that too, the atmospheric weight that this house always had, especially in the corridors, and it had been getting worse for months up to this point, just completely vanished. The dogs and their weird behavior stopped as well. It did take us a few weeks as well, but eventually we did fix everything and, well, the house is back to normal. I've always joked that our dog Barnaby was kind of a total idiot. He's a massive 90-pound Newfoundland mix with a big white patch on his chest and one random tan spot on his back leg. Usually he's just a complete klutz too, always misjudging distances, literally tripping over his own paws and whimpering if there's a slight draft in the room. Last Friday night, I was down in my basement workshop tinkering with an old generator. A heavy winter rain was hammering against the high windows and the whole basement felt really damp and cold. I adjusted my work light, and that's when I noticed Barnaby sitting perfectly upright on the top of a 6-foot-tall steel storage cage in the back corner. Now, Barnaby is terrified of that basement. He won't even look down the concrete stairs, let alone come down them. But there he was, perched completely still on a wire mesh roof that should have buckled under his weight, staring right down at my workbench. I wasn't just startled. I felt this deep physical wave of just pure revulsion. The hair on my arm stood dead straight, too. Hey boy, I muttered, my voice sounding thin and really echoing weirdly against the brick at this point. How did you get up there? He didn't whine. He didn't blink. He just tracked my hands while I worked. I reached out to grab a socket wrench at one point, and his whole head sort of swiveled to follow my hand, with this terrifyingly smooth, robotic precision. That's when I noticed that it didn't look like a dog watching something. It felt like something else. I reached into the bin where we keep the dried liver treats that he usually goes crazy for, and tossed a handful at the base of the cage. They scattered on the ground right below him, and he didn't even look down at the food. He just kept those wide, unblinking eyes locked dead on my face. I decided then that I was done for the night. I started cleaning the bench up, but the second that I stepped toward those stairs, this thing made a sound. Now, it wasn't a growl or a bark. It was a really weird metallic chattering is the best way that I can describe it. Like a electrical relay switch flipping over and over again. I completely freaked out upon hearing that. I didn't care how crazy I looked. I grabbed a heavy steel pry bar from the rack, held it up and shouted at him to get down. Now, any normal dog would have bolted or cowered or something, but this thing just stood up slowly. It stretched its front legs out to climb down, and for a split second, its leg joints looked like they were bending completely backward. It dropped to the floor, making a dull, wet and heavy thud against the concrete slab. It didn't run, it just walked, with this deliberate, stiff and unnatural pace, straight into the dark corner of the crawlspace drainage pit. I didn't follow it. I lunged up the concrete stairs, slammed the heavy wooden door shut, threw the deadbolt, and wedged a thick metal pipe under the handle. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold my keys. And then, less than 10 seconds later, I heard a familiar, lazy tail wag from the living room. Barnaby was curled up tight in his dog bed, right by the heater, where he normally is, looking groggy and annoyed that I'd made so much noise. He had clearly been asleep there for some time. The next morning, I went back down to check the workshop. The liver treats were still sitting on the floor untouched, but right where that thing had been sitting on the top of the steel cage, the metal mesh seemed to have snapped. The heavy wire hadn't just bent as well. It looked like it had been cut by a laser cutter or something. Well, I've been down there back in the workshop a few times, but never after 5 p.m. since then. I'm starting to think that whatever is down there, well, it can have that space at night, and I'll just keep that door locked, with that steel pipe reinforcing it, for good measure. So I've spent about 6 years working as a festival lighting technician, so my whole life is pretty much about understanding shadows, glares, and how light plays tricks on you. 3 summers ago, my family stayed at this massive old heritage hotel up in the hills of Daylesford, Victoria. It was one of those giant, old-school guest houses from the late 1800s with huge timber verandas. I got up at around 4:30 to catch the sunrise for some reference photos that I needed for a staging project. The main lounge was completely dark and quiet, so I walked out onto the big timber deck overlooking the valley. The fog was brutal, that thick, wet mountain mist that just swallows up all sound. I was setting up my tripod when I noticed a guy standing by the railing about 20 meters away. He was wearing a heavy flannelette shirt with the sleeves rolled up, leaning way over the edge and staring down into the mist. I figured that he was just another early bird, so I ignored him until I looked through my digital viewfinder. My camera's autofocus completely lost its mind. The lens just kept hunting back and forth, zipping in and out because it couldn't lock onto him at all. It was almost like there was nothing solid there. I lowered the camera and just looked at him with my own eyes. And that's when I noticed that the guy was literally semi-transparent. I could distinctly see the wooden slats of the railing right through his forearms. He wasn't glowing or anything, but his body just sort of lacked any real density to it. Now, since I work with lights, my first instance was to look for a projector trick. I turned around to check the windows behind me, looking for a hidden lens or a laser hitting the fog. But when he moved, he didn't walk. He, skipped. 1 second he was leaning on the rail, and the next there was a flicker, and he was standing perfectly upright 5 feet to the left. Then he turned his head. He didn't have a face. It was just a smooth, blurry smudge where his features should have been. It looked a lot like a censored face that you see online from time to time. He started to lift his left arm, and the exact millisecond that he did, a sharp line of white light sliced right down through him, and then he was just gone. The mist didn't swirl, nothing had moved, just this light beam, and then he literally just blinked out of existence. While looking around the deck for a rational explanation, I noticed an old timber latch leading to a crawl space right below his spot, and it was slightly jarred open. I pried it up and shone my light down. Crouched in the dirt was a filthy, heavy-set guy in a zipped-up hoodie holding a massive pair of rusted bolt cutters. He was staring straight up at me, completely frozen, surrounded by empty food tins and what looked like a map of the hotel grounds, with rooms and numbers and circles and stuff like that. I slammed the hatch down, locked it from the outside, and bolted. I went straight to the front desk and told them about the guy in the crawl space. I didn't mention the other guy that was like a ghost or whatever, but anyway, they eventually got this guy. Well, the police did after they called them. And apparently, he'd been living down there for quite some time by this point. I don't know the whole story, but I was sort of let in on a small detail that, well, apparently this guy was pretty bad news. I don't know exactly what that means, but the front desk and the police were both very thankful that I had spoken up and done something about it. Anyway, that is probably the strangest thing that I've ever encountered in my entire life, and honestly, I don't know what to make of it. I've always been the kind of person who prefers the logic of a spreadsheet over anything vague. But there's one weird thing from my childhood in rural Delaware that I just cannot explain away. So when I was about 6, we lived in this rental house where my bedroom layout was just completely off. My bed faced a built-in wardrobe with a door that wouldn't stay shut no matter how much you tried. And every single night, this figure would pop right up in the gap of the door. It looked like a woman with the skin color of like raw dough and hair so long that it literally pooled on the floorboards. She'd stand completely still, gripping the edge of the doorframe. But the part that totally froze me was her eye. She only had one, this tiny piercing white dot of light that glowed even when the room was pitch black. I spent months doing this thing that I called something like weaponized ignoring at the time. I figured that if I didn't look at her, that she couldn't move, and I'd just stare at the ceiling until my eyes burned, eventually passing out from pure exhaustion after a few nights of getting no rest. Everything, though, changed the week that my grandfather went into hospice. The air in the house, it felt really heavy, like the pressure had tripled. That Friday night, too, I looked over at the wardrobe and realized that she wasn't in the gap anymore. Instead, She was standing right on the carpet, just a few feet closer than she'd ever been. But before I could even draw a breath to scream, she didn't just walk, she blurred. She crossed the room with a speed that was just not even possible, really. Her face was so close to mine all of a sudden that I could smell this really weird sort of chemical smell. My vision suddenly went totally black, and all I remember is being dropped into this most intense and terrifying dream of my life. In the dream, it was a beautiful sunny morning, and I walked through the house, but it was like a total vacuum. My parents' cars were gone, my baby brother's crib was completely empty, and there wasn't a single sound of birds or traffic outside or anything. I ran to my back room sobbing, and the camera of my dream suddenly sort of zoomed in on the corner of the nursery next door. It was an old white wicker rocking chair that we didn't own, and sitting on it were two toys that I'd never seen before. A tattered rag doll and a blue stuffed elephant with one missing button eye. Just looking at the elephant filled me with a despair so deep that it felt like my chest was collapsing. I woke up screaming, and from that night on, the woman in the wardrobe, well, I never saw her again. And, weirdly enough, the door now stayed perfectly shut. Well, fast forward 7 years and we had moved a few towns over. I was helping my mum clear out some old boxes left in the crawl space by the previous tenants when I reached into a canvas bag and I pulled out that exact blue stuffed elephant. Same missing eye and everything. Same matted fur from my dream. I didn't even ask. I ran it straight to the big bin at the edge of the property and buried it under the trash. Even now in my 30s, I can't handle a room where a closet door is ajar. If I wake up and see a sliver of darkness in a doorway, I have a literal full-blown panic attack sometimes. When we cleared out the rest of that box later that afternoon, my dad found a heavy vintage steel sewing needle driven deep into the wood of the crate itself. It wasn't normal sewing gear too. The thick metal had been bent into like a sharp, jagged hook by hand, and the tip was caked in a dark, dried residue that, well, looked a lot like blood. I've looked into stress-induced night terrors before, but a brain trick doesn't explain the elephant. And that's the thing that has always stuck with me all these years, and why I cannot just dismiss it. So I spent 4 years working the graveyard shift as a mobile security guard out in rural North Dakota. The facility that I was at was this massive mid-19th century brick asylum that the county had gutted and turned into climate-controlled vaults to store old pioneer-era ledgers and land deeds, I think, or something. Anyway, it looked pretty cool during the day, but by 2 o'clock at night, those long hallways felt incredibly heavy and were dead quiet. Now, I'm a pretty practical, routine-driven guy. I usually spent my rounds listening to sports radio and checking the locks on the fire doors, but there was one specific window on the top floor of the West Wing that I hated looking at whenever I crossed the main courtyard. One freezing night in January, too, I was walking across the icy asphalt to my truck to grab a spare flashlight battery, and I accidentally glanced up at the dark windows of the upper records room. And even though the indoor lights were turned way down to emergency mode, I could see something pressed flat against the glass. At first, my brain thought that it was a big, antique white serving platter someone left on the sill, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized that it was a face. It was perfectly round, completely flat, and had the dull chalk look of unpolished bone. It had a nose and a mouth, and 2 eyes that I could see, but the absolute worst part of it was the body attached to it. It didn't have a torso or arms. The round head was hooked up to a thick segmented stalk, looking exactly like the pale fleshly underside of a massive millipede. The whole thing just stretched backward into the pitch-black room behind it, and it had to have been at least 10 feet long, slowly coiling and bunching itself up against the wooden window frame. It didn't move like a normal animal, too. It sort of ripped with this slow, rhythmic twitch. The best way to describe it is like a deep-sea creature moving in a current. A wave, though, of just pure physical nausea hit me so hard that I had to lean against the hood of my truck. I forced myself to look away, my heart going so quickly that I thought that I was having a panic attack, and I didn't look up again until I was locked safe inside of the main guard shack. While checking the perimeter fence line of that wing the next morning, I found several pictures or photos that had the eyes neatly cut out of them. and I know that they weren't there the day before this. Later at the shift handover, the older guard that I was relieving, a guy named Vance, who had been on this contract for some time now, noticed that I looked completely ghost white. And before I could even log out of the computer, he leaned back, tapped his coffee thermo, and mumbled, "You saw the dinner plate up in the West Wing, didn't you? Don't look at it. It just sits up there, man." I hadn't said a single word about my round. I hadn't even hinted that I looked up at the top floor. But he knew exactly what it was. That flat circular face on that thick millipede body. He told me that the thing, it didn't have bones, apparently. It just sometimes is there when people walk past and they see it. Apparently it's never done anything to anyone, but it certainly freaks a lot of people out. Anyway, a week later, I had to do one final check of that room before quitting, and right along the inside wooden sill of that specific window, I noticed that the old trim there, well, something had been eating away at it. The bare wood was coated as well in this thick, sticky, slime that smelled incredibly strong, like a mix of ammonia and wet concrete almost. It was horrible and not normal, that much was clear. Anyway, I handed in my notice the next morning, and I still live in this area, and I still like old historical buildings, but I keep my eyes on the ground these days and try to stay away from places like that. And I know that people might have some questions about this thing, but really, I've given you everything and all the information that I have. The regional sorting hub outside of Albuquerque is basically 500,000 square feet of corrugated steel and concrete, positioned right where the high desert starts to turn into scrubland. I took a job as a night shift logistics coordinator there last month to save up for some tuition. My post is the tower, a glass-walled observation pod that hangs over the main floor, giving me a bird's-eye view of the intake conveyors and the pallet stacking robots. It's usually a mindless grind, really. The automated systems hum at a constant dull frequency, and the only real excitement is when a scanner misreads a shipping label and kicks a package off of the line. So, at 3:15 a.m. last Tuesday, the facility-wide power grid dipped. It didn't black out entirely. The entire light array just sort of shifted from standard white to a deep monochromatic amber. The heavy automated conveyor line, which usually moves at a steady, synchronized pace, came to a dead stop. I checked my monitors. Every sensor on the floor was reporting null, which should be impossible, unless the entire back-end server had been wiped. I grabbed my radio, called out to the 2-floor technicians, and got nothing but dead air. No static, just a flat, pressurized silence. I walked down the metal stairs from the towers to the main floor. The temperature had plummeted at this point, turning the air so thin and frigid that it felt like breathing through a wet woolen mask. The vast warehouse, usually filled with mechanical clatter of shipping, was now utterly, violently silent. When I reached the main intake zone, I saw the technicians standing perfectly still in the center of the loading bay. They were facing the wall, their hands flat against the corrugated metal, their fingers spread wide. The palms of their hands were pressed so hard against the steel that the metal was bowing inward around their knuckles. I called their names, but they didn't flinch. I walked up behind the tech guy, Gary, and tapped his shoulder. But he felt like he was carved out of wood, rigid and completely unresponsive. As I stepped around to see his face, I realized why he wasn't moving. His eyes weren't closed, they were wide open, staring at the corrugated metal wall, but where his pupils should have been, they were just tiny, perfectly circular mirrors reflecting the light of the room. He wasn't even breathing. A sort of black fluid was also leaking from his tear ducts, tracing perfect geometric lines down his cheeks before evaporating into the air before it could reach his collar. I backed away, stumbling over a discarded pallet, and as I did, I glanced at the conveyor belt. The heavy plastic-wrapped pallets of merchandise were just sitting there, and that's when I noticed that they were slowly sinking into the solid steel floor plates, as if the concrete had turned to liquid mercury. I could see the cardboard boxes warping as they pulled downward, the pressure crushing them into thin flat sheets as if they absorbed into the floor. I didn't try to pull them away. I didn't try to wake them up either. I just turned and sprinted for the emergency exit on the north side. The heavy steel door was still locked from the outside, which was actually a violation of every safety code that we had, but I didn't reach for my keys. I just shoved my shoulder into the frame and the metal gave way like warm wax, tearing off the hinges without a sound. I ran to my truck, scrambled to get the engine turning, and didn't look back at the warehouse until I was 5 miles down the highway. My hands were shaking so hard that I could barely grip the steering wheel. When I finally stopped at a 24-hour station in Santa Fe to get a coffee, I checked my work phone. The app for the security camera was still live. I clicked on the feed for the loading bay and the cameras were working, but the footage was inverted. The floor was now the ceiling and the 2 technicians were standing on the surface of the warehouse roof, staring down at the empty concrete floor. Their bodies were twisted at weird angles, limbs overlapping in impossible loops, their spines bent into like concave arcs. I knew at the time that was probably because there was something wrong with the cameras, but still, really there shouldn't be anything wrong with them, and so I don't know what to make of that. Anyway, eventually I went back, and when I got there, it was as if nothing had happened. I grew up in an old, sprawling farmhouse in New Hampshire. Looking back on it now, the unwritten protocols that we lived by inside of those walls, it felt less like domestic routines and more like the frantic logic of a severe delirium. My parents purchased the property in the early autumn of 1998, and from the very first afternoon, a small faded oil painting of an empty canal hanging from a rusted iron peg in the pantry always freaked them out. During the final walkthrough, the previous tenant, a deeply eccentric elderly widow, warned my father with absolute gravity that if that specific frame were ever unhooked, the equilibrium of the structure would permanently fail, is what she said apparently. My father was a completely pragmatic, level-headed contractor, yet he guarded that cheap landscape with an unsettling intensity. For over a decade, it was never touched. When I was roughly 4 years old, I began having frantic repetitive arguments with my mother because I wanted to go down into the stone root cellar to help the other boy clear the wood. I would insist to her that his guardian was forcing him to stack old cedar crates in the dark and that he was strictly forbidden from speaking aloud to me. My mother, desperately attempting to suppress my terror, consistently dismissed it as a hyperactive imagination, but she immediately installed a heavy brass deadbolt on the cellar door and turned the key every single night. The subterranean level of that house was an absolute maze of damp foundations too. It contained a half-finished laundry area that smelled intensely of scorched wire, a small water closet where the basin had been ripped out and the drain line was plugged with a heavy rubber expanding stopper, and a dark storage inlet where my father kept his redundant mechanical tools. My siblings and I used to navigate that space a lot, but we maintained a rigid sort of unspoken contract, I guess you could call it. No one ever remained in the laundry area if the light bulb in the tool area went out. It always felt as though the darkness of those foundational corners were physically heavier and more opaque than the natural shadows should be. It was a weird place and we all knew it. But then there was this man who lived across the gravel road, an isolated neighbor named Gideon, who occupied a dilapidated timber cabin. He was well into his late 70s and had developed a persistent sort of habit of dropping off bundles of kindling and stacks of outdated farm journals on our rear porch between midnight and dawn. He was utterly convinced that our family was freezing to death because he rarely observed soot or exhaust rising from our external furnace stack. My father, he was forced to manually haul the wood back across the road every weekend too, an action that resulted in Gideon standing silently at the edge of the clearing, tracking our movements through heavy field binoculars while we played in the grass. The most severe incident involved Gideon occurred during a humid afternoon when I was about 5, I think. I was playing near the boundary line of our property when he just sort of materialized from the dense briars, telling me that there was an injured hawk in the brush that required my attention. He gripped my arm and began guiding me toward the thickest section of the timber. My older sister, who was only 7 at the time, spotted the interaction from the porch and came sprinting down the incline, hurling heavy gravel rocks at him until he finally released his grip on my clothing. My father immediately contacted the local sheriff's department, but the intervention did little to stop Gideon. He would simply park his old utility truck at the very edge of the property, staring fixedly at our front entrance for hours. Gideon, he passed away due to a sudden heart attack, and when the liquidators finally gained entry into his cabin, they discovered that he had completely sealed every window from the interior using thick plywood sheets. And he had meticulously reconstructed our entire household floor plan across his main living room wall using red pushpins and industrial twine. Following his death, the farmhouse became active in a way that felt as though the space itself was trying to break a sudden silence. We would return home from school to discover the heavy rear sliding door thrown completely open and the kitchen microwave running on high, the internal glass platter spinning completely empty with the digital counter set to 9999. Absolutely nothing was ever stolen or displaced or anything, but the kitchen, it felt weird. When my parents eventually separated years later, and the rooms were stripped half bare, the occurrences turned distinctly aggressive. My older sister, she was managing a load of linens late one evening and left a completely full, factory-sealed container of industrial liquid starch resting on top of the washing machine. She stepped away for less than 10 minutes, and when she returned, the jug was lying on its side in the center of the concrete floor, completely drained of its contents. The plastic safety seal had been cleanly sliced away with a blade almost, and was resting on the lint trap, while the screw cap had been placed with precision over the exact center of the floor drain. On another occasion, I had this old battery-operated electronic toy organ in the basement, a cheap plastic unit manufactured in like the mid-1980s, I think. But the internal cells had ruptured and leaked corrosive acid everywhere years prior, making the circuits entirely dead. But one afternoon, while I was rummaging through some storage for some work boots, that dead toy began suddenly broadcasting. The notes were severely dragged and distorted, and dropped in pitch, sounding as though it was on its last legs, but I abandoned the boots entirely and bolted up the stairs because, well, I knew that was pretty much impossible. The upper level offered no reprieve, too. I was resting in my bedroom one day when the latch on my door clicked open, and a solid dark silhouette roughly the size of a bird sort of shot out from the hallway and dove straight beneath my heavy oak chest of drawers. Convinced at the moment that a bat had somehow entered the house, I shoved the heavy furniture away from the wall, but there was absolutely nothing behind it, except for some dust. Even my mother, who steadfastly refused to acknowledge any anomalous behavior in the house, completely broke her silence while preparing the property for an open house showing. She distinctly heard her sister's voice, extremely clear, sharp, and high-pitched, calling her name from the master suite. She entered the room under the impression that my aunt had arrived early to assist with staging, but the room was empty. When she called my aunt, she discovered that she was still driving the interstate over 60 miles away. The definitive break, though, occurred while I was taking a shower. So the stall was enclosed by this thick, frosted glass paneling, and I heard a sharp, distinct knock against the frame. My sister's voice clearly stated that she needed to get the medical kit from the wall cabinet. Through the glass, I watched the dense silhouette of a person pressed flat against the pane, looming there in total stillness. The figure remained completely motionless for 5 minutes at least, without shifting its weight even a single inch. When I finally gathered the nerve to slide the glass panel aside, the bathroom was completely empty, and the heavy privacy bolt in the main door, well, it was still firmly engaged from the inside, which meant that there was no way that anybody could have made it in. Now, we had many other things happen too, like knives appearing randomly underneath people's pillows, which we swore that none of us ever put there. On one occasion, the house almost burnt down because the stove was on, that, again, we all swore that we hadn't turned it on. We officially transferred the deeds to the property the following week, after that shower incident though. I occasionally locate the farmhouse on Google Maps from time to time, and I find myself wondering if that old faded painting of the canal is still hanging on its peg in the pantry, or if the subsequent residents were pragmatic enough to take it down. Considering the property has been relisted on the rental market 3 separate times over the last 4 months, I am highly inclined to believe that, well, they must have moved it. I've stayed away from the old shipping yards in Erie, Pennsylvania for about 4 months now. I'm 32 and I've lived in this region most of my life. But what happened back in November, it pushed me past the point of being curious about abandoned industrial places. So there's an old, decommissioned ore dock near the lakefront rail terminal that has been completely gated off since the late 1970s. It sits right on the border of a massive unmaintained lot filled with rusted iron crate parts and industrial scrap. Usually, a few of us would get together on Saturday nights to just sort of hang out and talk near the access gates. But we got bored one day and decided to play a game of hide and seek across the debris field. It was probably about 10:30 in the evening. The moon was visible, but the shadows between the massive iron structures were thick enough that you couldn't even really see your own feet. My cousin, Marcus, was searching, and he's the kind of guy who notices the slightest bit of movement from a distance, so I decided to play it smart. I was wearing a dark canvas jacket and heavy work trousers at the time, so I crawled over to the foundation of the main loading house. I then pressed myself flat against the stone wall, right behind a stack of discarded rubber conveyor belts, and I tried not to move. I was sitting there for maybe 10 minutes, I would say, just listening to Marcus moving around about 60 yards away, when I felt a sudden sort of drop in the temperature right against the back of my neck. I looked over my shoulder a couple of times because it was so weird, but it was just the same dark stone and the empty shadows. When Marcus started heading toward the far side of the enclosure, I saw my chance to bolt for the designated safe zone and win the round. So I stood up to run, but for some reason I did one last look back at the precise spot where I'd been crouching, and I swear to you that something was standing exactly where I had just been. Whatever it wasn't a human. It was this pale, spindly shape, easily 7 feet tall, but it was hunched over, aggressively, as if its torso was too long for its legs. It didn't seem to have a face in the normal sense. It sort of looked like a smooth porcelain mask with a horizontal slit where the mouth should have been. And then there were these 2 milky, reflective orbs set deep into that opening. It was just staring fixedly at the exact spot where my head had been seconds before as well. I didn't even yell. I sort of tripped backward over the conveyor belts and scrambled away. Marcus, he heard the impact and came jogging over, probably ready to laugh about me being clumsy, but he stopped about 15 feet away from me. He wasn't looking at this entity behind me. He was staring at the thick tree line near the marshy edge of the property. I scrambled to my feet and asked him what he was looking at, and his voice was completely flat, devoid of any inflection. He just pointed a finger and said, "What is that thing's neck doing?" I looked over, and behind one of the thick willow trees at the edge of the lot, there was a second silhouette. This one was entirely pitch black though, but it possessed that same sort of distorted, elongated proportions. It was peering out from behind the trunk, but, and I know that this is going to sound weird, but its head was rotating in a sort of continuous 360-degree circle, over and over again, while its eyes, just 2 glowing static pinpricks, stayed completely fixed on Marcus. Well, we didn't stick around to see what these things were. We cleared the chain link perimeter fence in record time, and we didn't stop running until we reached some stores. When we finally looked back after we got to safety, well, we didn't see the creatures anymore, and so I don't think that they followed us. We told the rest of our friends, but they just joked about us seeing trespassers or letting the dark get to us. Marcus and I don't really care though. We both saw the way that those things moved, and it completely defied human anatomy. I still have the deep scuffs on my boots from scrambling over the scrap that night too, but I know one thing. I won't be going back to that terminal to get a closer look at anything. In fact, I've even started taking the long highway route home just so that I don't have to drive past those iron structures after dark. This happened when I was about 27 years old. So my spouse and I had traveled to Boston, Massachusetts for an anniversary trip and had rented a historic suite inside of a converted 18th century brick brownstone right in the North End. The place, it had incredible character. Massively exposed timber beams, uneven pine floors, and that dense, heavy quiet that you only really find in the oldest parts of New England. Our reservation was for Suite 3, located on the second floor of the building. The first few days of the trip were perfectly routine, too. We spent our time exploring the old burial grounds, walking the Freedom Trail, and eating at some local places. We finally made it back to the building at around 10:30 on a Tuesday, completely drained from walking the brick hills. Now, I distinctly remember securing the heavy iron deadbolt, locking the security latch on the frame, and also checking that the sash window was firmly latched down. Now, I'm an incredibly dense sleeper once I drop off, but my partner is a hyper-vigilant sleeper who wakes up if a floorboard creaks anywhere in the hall. We were both asleep by midnight, but at exactly 2:40 in the morning, I snapped into full consciousness for some reason. I wasn't lying down under the covers. I was standing perfectly upright, balanced on both feet, in the center of a room that I'd never seen before in my life. My immediate thought was that I was experiencing a severe, sudden sort of neurological breakdown, or that we had somehow been targeted in a home invasion. I felt completely detached from my own skin, as if I were sitting in the back of a dark auditorium watching my physical body operate from a distance. I forced myself to stay calm, though, and systematically inspected the environment to find a way out. The room was an expansive, barren rectangle, though. Our rented suite was fully furnished, with contemporary rugs and couches, but this place was entirely gutted. The floor consisted of raw, unfinished dark timber planks. Where our high plastered ceiling should have been, there were low, sagging brick arches that felt like they were physically pressing down toward my head. I looked toward the wall where our kitchenette was supposed to be, but it was entirely absent now. Instead, a narrow, unlit hallway led into a small, secondary place that looked like an old storage larder. I walked toward a small, heavily grimed window pane at the far side of the space. As I moved, I realized my motor control was completely compromised. It felt exactly like a severe communication delay. I would mentally command my neck to turn, and my anatomy would execute the movement, but it was always a fraction of a second later. I looked through the dirty glass and could see the distinct silhouette of the Old North Church spire. I recognized the metropolitan skyline immediately, but the altitude was completely incorrect. I was looking down at the surrounding roofs of a height far greater than the second floor. I turned back toward the center of the bare floor and noticed a set of double wooden doors. In my state of total foggy disorientation, I managed to convince myself that my partner was right on the other side of the wood, and that opening them would place me back inside the suite. I pushed the panels forward, and the hinges operated in absolute silence. It was a small, windowless bedroom chamber. A single rusted iron cot was shoved against the far brickwork, and resting on top of it was a man. Heavily built, completely bald, easily in his late 60s. He was laying flat on his back on the top of the bare mattress, fully clothed in dark trousers and a stained grey undershirt. He looked as though he had simply dropped backward into a deep sleep as well, and before I could take a step backward to retreat, his entire torso flexed upward at a sharp 90-degree angle. He didn't lift his hands or use his arms to leverage his weight. It was a single, smooth, mechanical pivot. He sat perfectly upright too, staring blindly into the darkness with completely vacant and expressionless eyes. I immediately began to stammer, terrified that he was about to lunge at me. I started to apologize frantically, telling him that I was completely lost and that I was trying to locate Suite 3. The man didn't exhibit a single trace of anger or surprise, though. He simply stared directly through my chest and spoke in a voice that sounded like heavy stones grinding together in a mixer. "This is Suite 8, he said. That was the entirety of the interaction. He didn't ask how I bypassed the perimeter, and he made no move to alert anyone. The instant that the last syllable left his mouth, though, I felt a violent physical shove against my shoulder blades from behind, despite the fact that the space behind me was completely empty. The very next second, I was standing on the exterior side of a heavy closed door, out in the building's main central stone stairwell. There was no audio of a bolt sliding or footsteps moving away on the other side of the wood, just dead, stagnant quiet. I looked out of the small window in the stairwell landing and realized that I was standing on the absolute top floor of the building. I turned and bolted down the steps, nearly losing my footing on the stone. I reached the door of Suite 3 and physically traced the brass number on the wood with my hand to ensure that my senses weren't actually failing me. And that's when I began hammering on the door with my fists, yelling for my partner to unlock it. When the lock finally turned and I was let inside, my partner was visibly shaking, holding a heavy iron fireplace shovel. They explained that they had awoken suddenly to find my side of the bed completely empty, while the main entrance door remained fully deadbolted, and the security latch was still fixed in place too. They were entirely convinced that someone had somehow entered the room and extracted me through that window, even though our suite was stories above the pavement. As I sat down on the mattress, I realized that my entire body was completely drenched. My t-shirt, my underwear, and the linen sheets where I'd even been sleeping prior to the incident were completely saturated in just sweat. In fact, it almost felt like I had just crawled out of a pool. Neither of us slept for the remainder of the night. I spent the hours until dawn quietly reciting every old prayer that I could remember from my youth, just trying to keep the bedroom walls from feeling like they were actively closing in on us. The following morning, we didn't even discuss what had happened. We simply left the apartment and took a long, silent walk through the Boston Common to clear our minds. We passed a small shop near the burial ground, and we purchased a small chunk of black tourmaline. The person behind the counter, they mentioned that it was traditionally used for stabilization and personal protection. We brought it back to the suite and slid it directly beneath the frame of the bed. We also began leaving small tokens on the brick mantelpiece, a small pour of bourbon and some local pastries. It felt completely irrational, but we desperately wanted whatever force was present in that building to recognize that we meant no disrespect to the space. We were desperate. Surprisingly enough, though, the adjustment actually seemed to alter the environment a bit. The distinct atmosphere in the suite shifted from a feeling of active hostility to something more akin to just quiet observation, I guess. On our final morning at the property, I was walking across the floor to grab a mug from the cupboard, and as I passed the low kitchen cabinetry, I felt a distinct soft impact against my shin. I looked down and saw that the drawer containing the silverware had slid smoothly open, just far enough to gently catch my leg as I stepped past it. Nobody else was within arm's reach of the counter. It wasn't a violent or aggressive movement, but it felt like a deliberate nudge for sure. I actually spoke out aloud to the empty room, feeling completely crazy, but saying thanks, and for the first time in like 3 days, the temperatures in the kitchen didn't feel freezing all of a sudden. Now, before we officially checked out and departed, my curiosity completely overrode my caution at one point, so I walked back up the central stairwell to the top floor to locate Suite 8. When I found the entrance, the door frame was completely sealed off with thick construction plastic and bore a prominent federal asbestos warning sign. I managed to peer through a small clearance gap in the plastic sheeting, and the interior was a total structural gut job. There were no finished floorboards, no interior walls, no furniture, and no iron cot, too. It was nothing but bare historic brickwork and mounds of old plaster debris. The digital electric lock on the doorframe, well, it didn't even seem to be connected to the power source anymore. I still have absolutely no rational explanation for how my physical body ended up inside of a secured, unpowered construction zone 2 full stories above our room, while our entire suite door remained deadbolted and latched from the inside. We are actually planning a return trip to Boston this coming winter, and my partner wants to reserve a space in the exact same location. Personally, I'm a bit torn by this. Part of me genuinely wants to see and is very curious about what was happening there, but the other part of me, well, it's completely terrified of waking up in the dark and hearing that flat, grinding voice tell me that I'm in the wrong room again. So I just finished helping my parents vacate their property in Grant County, New Mexico, and we finally had an open discussion about why they were so eager to sell the home that they purchased just a mere 4 years prior. So I resided there for about 12 months after completing my degree, and I originally assumed the structure simply suffered from, unusual sounds. But the details that they finally disclosed are far more perplexing. So the residence is a contemporary sort of high-desert industrial design, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass paneling, polished concrete flooring, and an expensive open-concept central layout. I occupied the guest suite while I was there, which was an isolated structure connected to the main house by an enclosed breezeway. Now, the anomalies, I guess you could call them, consistently originated in the observation suite, a small office enclosed entirely by glass walls. It was actually a really neat room, but my primary hobby at the time involved an old analog shortwave receiver that I had meticulously restored. It featured heavy brass turning dials and a backlit amber frequency display as well. I frequently stayed up past midnight attempting to intercept long-range signals from Central America. One evening at around 1:30 in the morning, the ambient atmosphere in the office became unnaturally weird. It's a bit difficult to describe, but it was like the sensation where the desert breeze sort of completely dies off, leaving the air feeling sort of stagnant and weird. I was seated at the workstations when the primary turning dial began to rotate rapidly. It wasn't slipping or shifting. The heavy brass wheel was being actively turned by a force with significant mechanical torque to it. I yanked my hands away and watched the entire radio unit begin to violently vibrate against the wood desk. Then, there was this weird sort of visual distortion. It was in the reflection of the glass window pane directly in front of me. It wasn't like a silhouette or anything, but it almost resembled like a vertical column, roughly 6 feet in height maybe, positioned dead center in the room, directly behind my chair. It didn't have any discernible features, but it was just sort of there. Suddenly, though, the radio's internal speaker emitted a sharp burst of like white noise, followed by an exact real-time vocal replication of my own voice. It wasn't a delayed playback, too. It was a perfect audio mimicry of me asking, "Who's in there?" despite the fact that I had remained completely silent. It seemed to be sort of relaying my thoughts. Then, this column surged directly toward my position. Thankfully, it didn't make any physical contact with my body, but it impacted the workstation with just this huge force, and the shortwave radio was instantly compacted. And what I mean by that is that the heavy steel housing wasn't just merely dented, it was flattened completely, as if it had been just subjected to a hydraulic press. I bolted for the exit, as you can probably imagine, and the moment that I hit the enclosed breezeway, I heard my mother's voice emanate from the office behind me, completely distinct, saying, "Turn off the lights, dear." My mother, though, was sound asleep in her bedroom, and I know that for a fact. When I finally pressed my parents for details during the move, they admitted that the land had apparently suffered from a severe structural resonance issue, is what they said. There was the auditory force, which is what I had encountered, I think, but there was also this visual manifestation that they talked about. My father observed it on multiple occasions, apparently. A figure in a faded, dust-covered dress would stride across the concrete patio and then simply just sort of vanish through the floor. As it turns out, the home, it was constructed directly over an abandoned subterranean mine shaft from the early 1910s. The topography as well had a documented history of severe geological failure, massive sinkholes that would open down in the old shafts without warning. One of the original site surveyors had vanished during an underground inspection, and the rumor at the time was that the shifting earth hadn't just trapped him, it had completely pulverized him under the shifting bedrock. The housing developers had poured a massive 12-foot thick solid concrete stabilization plug directly into the old shaft opening before pouring the residential slab for the guest wing. My father confessed that on completely silent winter nights that he could press his ear flat against the concrete floor and hear something down there. That's creepy, right? Anyway, the final thing that happened that caused my mother to completely break down was discovering my ruined shortwave radio inside of a storage bin. She swore that she had never touched it, but obviously that was really weird, and she confirmed with me about all of this stuff, and, well, that was enough for her. We're completely finished with New Mexico now, and we've all relocated to a high-rise condominium in coastal Georgia just last month. My father actually explicitly stated that he refuses to ever live on top of a solid concrete foundation ever again after living in that place. And look, obviously I have no idea what any of this was, but I will swear to the truth of everything that I've said here until the day that I die. So I finally convinced my older sister to sit down and talk about the foundry house that we lived in back in the late 1990s. We rented this cramped, asbestos-siding duplex near the heavy manufacturing canals in Indiana. I was only 7 when we finally broke the lease, but I've always retained a singular vivid memory that felt less like a dream and more like, I don't know, an error in physical reality. The property, though, it possessed an unnatural sort of crushing weight to it. My bedroom, it was located in a modified basement cellar, accessed only by a remarkably steep and unlit wooden staircase. My absolute favorite possession at the time was a heavy motorized toy crane, one of those vintage plastic models that would rotate its cab and drop a magnetic hook if you threw the toggle switch on the base. It required 4 massive batteries, giving the chassis quite a lot of weight to it. Now, my mother, she completely despised that basement level. She admitted to me recently that every single time that she descended those stairs to bring down laundry, she would experience just a suffocating physical pull right in the center of her chest, and had a real hard time breathing down there. My father, an uncompromising rationalist, simply insisted that the neighborhood was constructed directly over old industrial marshland, and that methane pockets are shifting subsoil, and that it was throwing off the building's internal air pressure or something like that. Anyway, the night the incident occurred, it was really cold. The wind was howling across the shipping canals, causing the old basement hopper windows to violently rattle with their rusted steel frames. I was sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor watching the crane arms swing when the batteries, which had been installed fresh that afternoon, instantly just lost all their voltage. The room also suddenly fell into an immediate silence. And that's when I saw something. It was a cluster or a formation of geometric shadows that resembled shards of vibrating black glass, hovering in the upper corner where the concrete foundation met the floor joists. It was sort of just hovering there, really, and it sounded like a malfunctioning electrical transformer, maybe. Suddenly, my heavy toy crane was violently jerked backward across the room. It didn't roll on its plastic wheels or anything. It moved as if it was attracted by a massive electromagnetic hoist, snapping into the air and literally hovering 3 feet above the floorboards. I watched it hover there in absolute paralysis, not knowing what to do or say. And then, and I will never forget this, the toy began to play like a loop of a woman frantically weeping, though the audio was heavily slowed and sort of degraded, sounding almost like a warped vinyl record, turning at a fraction of its intended speed. It was horrifying, though, and I began to scream at the top of my lungs. At the exact millisecond that my father slammed his boots onto the bottom step of the staircase, though, this geometric shadow up in the corner just vanished. The toy instantaneously dropped, and a cloud of black industrial soot collapsed out of the corner, coating my bedsheets and the surrounding floor in this grimy layer that smelled instantly of burnt sulfur and like hot iron or something. My dad, he came downstairs, and I was absolutely hysterical, and I refused to stay down there after that, moved all of my stuff out of that room, and I slept upstairs in a different room for years. When my parents finally disclosed the full history of the property years later as well, they admitted that the home suffered from something. But the particular detail that really unsettled me was that my mother told me that when she picked up the toy crane to discard it, she extracted the batteries, and they hadn't just sort of discharged. The 4 independent batteries had been completely fused together into a singular twisted lump of metal. Also, she said, and I really don't even know how this is possible, but the stamped factory lettering on the sides of the casings had been completely inverted into a perfect mirror image. We eventually moved out of that place, thankfully, several years later, but when we did move, we were all just so relieved to get out of that place. So I know I'm going to get completely torn apart for bringing one of these things home, but I purchased a Ouija board a few months ago, and honestly, I thought it was just an interesting piece of historical metalwork to display on a bookshelf. It's actually made of metal and not just cardboard or wood. But since introducing it to my apartment, the atmosphere has completely shifted from, completely normal to just downright unsettling. It all began with really subtle things too. Like the digital thermostat in my hallway, I noticed one day that it was cycling rapidly through extreme temperature settings in a really weird sequence. And then there was the banging inside of the drywall that sounded like a mallet striking the support beams. I thought that I just had an infestation problem. Driven by frustrated curiosity, though, I decided to try the Ouija board a few nights ago. I'm fully aware that every standard caution warns against operating these types of things alone, but I just wanted some answers. When I asked if there was a presence in the room, this pendulum instantly began swinging in violent and erratic ellipses. When I asked who this was, it bypassed the alphabet and swung back and forth over a precise string of, corresponding calendar dates maybe, in 2014. The air pressure in the bedroom dropped instantly, though, upon asking that, making my ears literally pop as if I were descending in an aircraft. I asked why that ear, and the weight systematically pointed out the letters, monitored. I then asked if it had been trailing me since my youth, and I've experienced reoccurring night terrors since childhood, involving a towering dark shadow silhouette watching me from the foot of my bed, and it spelt out affirm. To test it, I posed a question that absolutely nobody else could answer. I asked for the exact name of the emergency dispatcher that I spoke with during a severe house fire that I survived 12 years ago. And I could hardly believe it, but it precisely spelt out the highly uncommon surname. Now, there's just no way that my subconscious mind could have guided my hand to that combination. I was just not moving this thing. The interaction turned incredibly hostile, though, when I brought up a severe personal crisis from my mid-20s, a freezer winter evening when I found myself standing on the ledge of an abandoned quarry. I've always recalled that specific night as a state of just complete disassociation, where I felt like a passenger trapped inside of my own skull while my limbs moved entirely on their own. So I asked the board if it had influenced my actions that night, and it spelled out the word steering. Upon seeing this, I immediately tried to end everything, but every time that I tried to clear the grid, a severe sort of icy numbness would creep into my forearm, forcing my fingers to lock up so that I couldn't. This whole thing was so intense as well that I ultimately just sort of kicked the entire table over and fled into the kitchen. During the cleanup the next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The heavy iron radiator in the corner of the bedroom, which had been disconnected for years, was now vibrating so violently that it had worn a deep raw groove into the hardwood floor. The metal pipes were ice cold to touch, but the iron structure was now vibrating so violently that I could literally feel it through my whole body when I touched it. I think I touched it 3 or maybe 4 times, and then all of a sudden it literally just stopped. Well, since that night, I've been trapped in a paralyzing and suffocating mental fog. It isn't depression or anything like that. In fact, it feels a lot like that night that, I lost control of my body. I don't have any traditional means to, clear the apartment or anything. I don't even know if I could, even if I tried. This whole thing just feels like a complete intrusion into my personal space and my private life. And so, has anyone else encountered anything like this before? And if you have, how did you get rid of it? And what did you do? So I occupied the lease for this place for about 14 months with a friend, and the atmosphere from the very first afternoon was intensely oppressive. It was a late 19th century brick house positioned at the cul-de-sac of an industrial access road near some rail tracks, but making it weirdly sort of unnaturally secluded for the city. Immediately after moving our furniture in as well, both of us experienced just a severe exhaustion. It wasn't the typical fatigue from a long shift or anything. It was almost like the air was thin and even breathing was difficult at times. We would regularly wake up at dawn feeling far more depleted than we should have been, typically following long stretches of hyper-detailed, exhausting dreams that felt like they spanned entire decades. The first indication, though, that this wasn't standard urban stress occurred roughly 4 months into the tenancy. So I woke up at around 2:30 in the morning with just this intense feeling of being watched. I was lying flat on my back, tracking the ceiling, when I observed a sort of transparent dark distortion glide across the plasterwork. It wasn't an external shadow thrown by a passing vehicle or anything. It looked more like a thermal ripple in the air, maintaining a really elongated shape. It slid out from the ventilation corner, moved directly over the light on the ceiling, and then just sort of flattened and dissolved into the plaster of the opposite partition. I didn't say anything to my roommate. I simply pulled the blanket over my face and I just stayed awake until dawn. The layout of the property was sort of equally disturbing in a way too. To reach the living room, we had to sort of traverse a narrow and high-walled brick passageway that was flanked by these old storage depots, I think they were. The path to get there had this single buzzing fixture that constantly cycled on and off, and we could never fix it, but one night while returning from the station alone, I felt a sharp, freezing blast of air strike my left jawline, followed instantaneously by the distinct sound of somebody violently gasping for breath less than an inch from my ear. When I looked around, though, there was nobody there. There was one incident, though, that occurred just 3 days before our lease was set to terminate, and it definitely was the last straw for us. So I was seated on the mattress, leaning over to lace up my boots before heading out to an early morning shift, and in the gap between my boots, a literal pale, emaciated arm rapidly thrusted out from beneath the low box spring of my bed and sort of rushed out and looked like it was trying to grab me. Now, this was no trick of the light, too. I could clearly see the texture of the skin, the dirt packed under the fingernails, the whole thing. It made a quick and violent grasping motion toward my left heel as well, missing it by less than 2 inches, and then snapped backward into the dark void beneath the frame in a fraction of a second. I didn't even stand up on the floorboards. I literally lunged directly onto the writing desk and flipped on my phone's camera flash, directing the beam beneath the bed frame. But the space was completely empty now. Mind you, the clearance was like less than 8 inches. There's just no physical way that a human being could have squeezed into that space. And the floorboards beneath the bed were completely solid. There's no ventilation or holes or anything down there. During the cleanup process, though, later that afternoon, I literally pulled the entire bed frame away from the wall to vacuum the baseboards and to take a look under there. And embedded, deep within the old plaster wall, right where the arm seemed to have sort of retracted, I found a rusted and heavy steel meat hook driven straight into the structural studs. It seemed to have been just painted over multiple times, matching the drywall, but the tip was sort of scraped raw, exposing fresh dark iron beneath the paint layer, and that's the only reason that I noticed it. Well, we handed over the keys 48 hours later, and the persistent fatigue and the grueling dreams, they completely stopped the very first evening that we checked into our new apartment. I spent a few weeks sort of researching that location, and I tried to find out anything that I could about the place, but there was nothing really about it. Which, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but either way, I'm just glad to be out of there, and also glad that I haven't had any experiences like that since. I've kept my bedroom windows pinned shut under heavy iron security latches since I was about 14, an obsession that my friends chalk up to standard home invasion anxiety. They don't know about the 5-minute block of time back in 2016 that completely ruined any sense of safety that I had left. We were renting a low, stucco-walled bungalow down in Savannah, Georgia. It was a suffocating summer night where the coastal humidity was thick enough to make the air feel greasy, so I had the wooden window sashes cranked as far up as they would go. My bed was an elevated, timber loft setup with a built-in workstation underneath, which placed my mattress perfectly level with the open window screen. I was leaning against the pillows, killing time on a text chain with a kid that I'd met while my family was traveling through Greece a few weeks prior. My window was covered by split-down-the-middle canvas curtains, and out of nowhere, I caught a soft, dragging friction, the distinct sound of fabric scraping across the metal wire of the window mesh. I looked over and watched the left curtain panel get sort of pinched from the outside and pulled flat against the frame. There wasn't enough breeze in the room to even stir a dust bunny, but that canvas was being held completely taut, exactly like someone holding a flap open to peer inside. I looked away and ignored it, which is a really embarrassing admission, but when you're a teenager, your brain will rationalize anything to avoid panic. Then, something dropped onto the bedding. It was a heavy, dead-weight impact right by my ankles. The fitted sheets, they snapped tight, and the foam mattress, it indented in a clean circular depression about the depth of a heavy boot heel. A second later, another compression formed 6 inches closer to my knees. Whatever it was standing on the mattress, shifting its physical weight forward. My thick winter jacket was bunched up right where the next stride was heading, and I watched the heavy down sleeve get crushed flat into the padding, compressed by an invisible heel. The room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. A massive wave of static electricity washed over my face too, and rolled down my spine, making every hair on my arm stand dead straight. It felt exactly like the prickling energy that you get when standing too close to high voltage. I didn't wait around to see if a face would manifest. I just vaulted over the side rail, hit the hardwood floor, and bolted to the hall to my parents' bedroom. My mother tried to handle it by consulting a youth counselor at our parish about a house blessing, but he told her that I was just experiencing behavioral stress from the move and consuming too much horror media. It was incredibly frustrating to witness a violent physical event like this, and to see the mattress materials actually buckle under massive weight, and have it written off as just nerves. I refused to step foot into that room after dark again, sleeping on a temporary mat in my parents' floor until I was nearly 16. I eventually forced my older sibling to trade bedrooms with me because I just couldn't handle being within arm's reach of that glass anymore. When we finally broke down the timber loft frame to move it to the other side of the house, my dad found a deep set of parallel gouges in the exterior stucco siding, leading straight up from the foundation to my windowsill. They were spaced precisely like human fingers, but the masonry, it had been chipped away by immense raw physical force, leaving some dark, greasy streaks behind that smelled faintly of heavy machine lubricant or something like that. I don't know if that's related or not, but I just thought that it's worth mentioning because it's a bit weird. Anyway, I'm 22 now and living 2 time zones away, but I still physically double-check the window latches every single night, always before my head hits the pillow. And all I can say is this. Once you watch the weight of something that shouldn't exist push down on your bed like that, well, you stop trusting the dark entirely. So when I was in my bedroom, my mum was in the living room with the lights off. This happened at around 8:30 p.m. and it's now past 10. My mum heard me come down the hallway and into the kitchen. She asked if I was okay, and she apparently heard a bit of a mumble back in my voice. She said that she didn't know what it said, but after that, the kitchen lit up as if I was using my phone flashlight to find something, and then it was gone. After that, she texted me to ask if I had been out of the living room, so I got up and left my room to talk to her and tell her that I hadn't. I had actually been in my room working on a project for at least the last few hours. So now, we're both freaking out. She kept asking if I was messing with her, and I swore that I wasn't. But we have been experiencing a few things here and there, actually, like strange noises, things moving around. My dad has also had a few of his own experiences. I think one was also about me, so whatever it is, it seems to keep impersonating me. I'm not sure if it's entirely related, but for the past year or so I've been feeling this very off energy around me as well. I've never been able to see ghosts, but I've been able to feel them, I think. Their energies and such, but this one is just off. The only way that I could describe it is wrong, and it's very inconsistent for when it shows up. Sometimes it's gone for a week and it comes back, or it's every other day sometimes, multiple nights in a row, etc. I also really only ever feel it in my room, sometimes elsewhere in the house, and it's always or usually at night anyway. I'm also not sure if they are related, and if they are, I'm not sure how to get rid of this thing, so if you have any advice, I would love it. I'm not a Christian or not religious or anything, so I wouldn't feel comfortable getting the house blessed or anything, which is part of the reason why I'm here. What does anyone do about the paranormal if they aren't religious? One rainy night back in my old apartment, the power went out, and so we bonded through conversations and genuine human interactions, just as we all should really. One of my friend's demeanors, though, suddenly changed, almost as if he was struck by lightning that froze his soul, and just as instantaneously began to gradually melt away into something that looked like fear. Slowly, he walked into the kitchen, which required a glass door to be slid open to the left before the kitchen hall could be seen. It was a studio apartment. He stared at the direction of the cupboards near the sink for nearly a minute, and due to curiosity, and a mix of irritation and anxiety, me and my other friend peeked in to see what he was looking at. We remained silent. I don't remember who went first, but we all eventually ended up chilling back in the room and carried on with our conversations. When we ran out of things to say, I finally said, "You all saw it too, didn't you?" No one spoke, and honestly, that was all the answer I needed. It was a shadowy figure of a man, presumably with a walking stick and a high hat. He was leaned against the countertop, and he appeared to be grinning, I would say. He didn't move an inch or display any hints whatsoever to whatever his intentions may have been, but He was just there. This was in 2002, and a month ago I saw him again. It was only me and a friend who were the last 2 people awake out of the group of around 7 people. I saw him, and the longer it went, the more the fear in my heart grew. The more he grew in size as well, it seemed. He didn't really grow in the typical sense of the word, though. He grew as, I believe, a direct manifestation of how much fear I perceived him with. My friend saw the terror on my face and told me that he believed me before I even said anything about it. In the afternoon, when everybody was finally awake, one of our friends revealed that another of our friend, a known and respected street dude, also had the same experience and was frozen in fear as a result of what he had seen. I'm wondering, though, is anyone familiar with this entity or what it could be? Why does it appear, and what is its usual agenda? It only ever disappears too every time I tell it that I'm not afraid, that I don't fear it, and I must mean it when I say it too, it seems. This only happens at the sight of him, though, and then he disappears slowly into a sort of misty nothingness as he grins subtly and perhaps even sort of giggles, I think. Or at least grins in a giggly manner, I guess you could say. But has anyone else seen or heard of anything like this before? Because I'm wondering if maybe I'm going crazy, or maybe there's something going on in my house that I'm just not aware of. This experience is one that I've never shared with anyone besides my brother. When I was about 13 years old, I was living in rural BC. One night I was in the hot tub on the deck outside just watching the woods, taking in the silence. It was wintertime and we had just recently had a snowfall that left around knee-high deep of snow. It was around 2 to 3 in the morning, and out of nowhere, this large wolf, bigger than one that I'd ever seen by far, came out of the woods. I remember its coat being a shimmering silver and its bright piercing green eyes. As this wolf was walking along the fence of our paddocks, it sort of locked eyes with mine, and we just kind of stared at each other as he walked past me, both alone in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. But what happened next, till this day, always makes my spine shiver. As the wolf walked past, he walked towards our barn with our horses in it. It became darker as it entered the barn, but the other side of the barn still had a bright light illuminating the outside that I could clearly see. And this wolf, as it entered, halfway through it went from the shape of a wolf to a very large, broad-shouldered person. The horses didn't make a single sound, and this person, that now stood roughly 7 feet tall, rounded the corner towards the open field, but didn't emerge from the other side, and after that I never saw it again. My brother had his own encounter with this same wolf, I think. He told me that he woke up randomly one night from the feeling of being watched. He then looked out of his window to see a very large wolf walking away from his window, so I'm guessing that it was watching him sleep or something. This place that we lived at was old native ground. Our barn was an old school house where the Catholic priest would put the native children and teach them lessons on Christ and all that. It even had the old desk and chairs inside still. My brother and I saw children's faces in the panes of glass from that barn, and lights turning on randomly too. We had closet doors slam repeatedly for minutes at a time, footsteps and feelings of being watched. In my room I saw glowing red eyes on the ceiling one time, and hid under my covers until morning. Anyway, the main reason why I'm sharing this, and what I'm really seeking answers for, is what did I encounter outside in the middle of the night that night? After I looked around myself, the closest thing that I could find was skinwalkers or wendigos, but from what I've read of these creatures, they have deformed features or things that make them uncanny or straight up horrific. What I saw, nothing struck me as abnormal about this wolf besides its massive size, until it literally changed its entire form in front of me. I know that this is getting a bit long, but I'm not a great storyteller, and there's just so much that I experienced at this property that this is really just scratching the surface to everything else. The wolf incident is just something that I've never really been able to grasp and always wanted some kind of an answer for, because it feels and sounds just so unbelievable. I know that. I also understand that the term skinwalker is Navajo lore and doesn't really correlate with the BC tribes, but this is just a representation of what I saw with, well, the closest accuracy that I can give you all. I've been living in this apartment for, well, almost a year now, I think, and I haven't had any experiences up until this last week. Things started up on Tuesday night while I was at work. My front door camera went off and there wasn't anyone there. Not that big of a deal, maybe an animal or something. But 15 minutes later and it went off again, but this time my porch light is on. So I checked back through and it was off when I left, off in the next video, and then just comes on again. I checked all of my other cameras inside and out, but there was no one at the house. For the rest of the night, the light goes on and off randomly as I keep checking. About 3 a.m. I turn on the camera and hear what sounds like someone talking, and the light is back on. I continue checking it, and 3:23 the light is off, and my coworker points out movement in the shadow in front of my door. I turn the camera lights on, but nothing there. This continued up until about 4:30, and then the light went off and stayed off. I got home at 7 and my TV was turned on, and that was definitely off when I left, but otherwise everything was pretty normal. I worked the rest of the week and everything seemed normal as I checked in through the cameras. I had an electrician friend come over and check the porch light out on Friday. It's all good. So tonight, Saturday is my night off and I'm home watching TV. I live alone, so it's just me and the cat sitting in the living room watching TV when I start hearing someone talking. It seems to be coming from my bedroom, which is at the front of the house. Knowing that there's no one here but me, I figure it's outside, so I check the cameras. I don't see anyone around, but it gets quiet, so I figure they must have just went on down the street or something. I settle back in for my movie, and there it goes again. I decide at this point to just sort of ignore it, thinking that it's somebody else passing by. But suddenly, I hear my friend Elle calling me from my bedroom, but he's not here. He's definitely at work. I mean, I dropped him off myself at 6:45 and he won't be off until at least 7. I went into the bedroom and double-checked, but it's empty. Since then, too, I've heard it 3 more times. My cats have also reached and gone to look down the hallway, but won't go any further. At this point, I've closed the door and am planning on sleeping on the couch tonight because this whole thing is, well, really freaky. I recently moved to Wisconsin and I wanted to explore the backcountry 2 falls ago, so I took a trip from the south to Superior, mostly off-road and on fire roads and whatnot. On my second night, I was in the North Woods and it was getting pretty late, so I was on a back road in heavy forest and decided to find a spot to sleep in my truck. I went down a dirt road, probably 2 miles or so down the dirt road. At this point, it was very dark, roughly 8 p.m. and absolutely no one for miles. I found a trail in the forest and drove about 100 feet into the woods and I parked, completely concealed from the dirt road that I was just on. I got out to assess the area, but couldn't see anything as it was completely dark. I got back in the truck and I set up for the night. About an hour into watching a movie on my phone, I heard a sound that sounded like a woman screaming and my dog heard it too. I grabbed my pistol, turned on all my lights and opened the door to see what it was. Mind you, absolutely no one knew that I was out there, and I was far from civilization. I didn't see or hear anyone, so I ducked back into my truck. I'll admit too that I was a little bit freaked out, but I figured that it must have been wildlife. I don't know, I rationalized it. In any case, maybe about an hour later I was falling asleep and I felt my truck move as if someone had pushed on it. Again, my dog woke up too, so I knew that it wasn't my imagination. I didn't turn on any lights or make a sound, but my dog seemed very uneasy all of a sudden. I told myself that if I heard anything else, I would get out of Dodge. Well, I ended up falling asleep, and maybe around midnight I woke up to my dog growling, and it happened again. I put on my boots and hopped in the driver's seat, and I just got out of there. Now, as I was driving out, I went around a corner on the dirt road, and I'm not sure if it was my imagination or what, but I swear that I saw a tall, skinny thing running off the road as I came around the corner. It took about 30 minutes to get down the road because I continued down the original dirt road and did not get back the way that I'd come from. By this point, it was raining pretty hard and I just didn't feel comfortable being anywhere dark anymore. I drove about an hour and I finally found a gas station and ended up staying the night there. But I have never been so scared in my life before, and honestly, it takes a fair bit to get me feeling that way. I don't know what it was, but I know it was not human, whatever was out there. That much is very clear. So long story short, my husband and I had heard a horrific car accident while we were camping and getting ready for bed in our tent. It was a super windy, dangerous road that led up to the camping areas, so we were immediately concerned about someone being in grave danger, and potentially with children at that. Without a single word to each other, we hopped up and ran to the direction that we heard the wreck take place. We got there at the same time just about as the police did, and ended up giving our info if needed and heading back to our campsite. Now, I was pretty pregnant at the time, so I really had to pee after all the running and the adrenaline. We decided to stop at the only restroom open at the time, which was a bit past our campsite, and incredibly dark without other campers around creating light. After I used the restroom, I'm walking back out to my husband when I noticed behind him a flash of light frantically bouncing up and down from someone booking it towards the restroom. Jokingly, I chuckled about this guy must really need to use the bathroom or something, but it was a very short-lived moment. This man stopped dead in front of us and basically whispered, "Wow, you guys are fast," and then smiled in the most unnerving way. It absolutely sank my stomach immediately, heartbeat pounding in my ears, instant nausea, goosebumps, you name it. Husband didn't seem put off by any means and noted that we were worried about the accident, etc. Dude continues on as if discussing the weather with a friend, saying that he's just used to this kind of stuff, asks if we're leaving tomorrow. I almost angrily ask, used to what? Which he shrugged off and just explained that he traveled a lot and camped. At that point, I had already started taking steps backwards, to the point there where my husband finally starts noticing something's off with at least me. In the moment, I decided to lie and say that we needed to get back to our tent, because the cops were coming to take our statements, which was completely false, but I, for whatever reason, just fabricated that, like verbal vomit, without even thinking. Even though my husband chimed in and agreed, saying that we needed to get back, this man does not stop. He starts matching our steps backwards with steps forwards towards us, and begins telling us that morning he went for a walk and found these beautiful flowers, but had heard a deep growl which scared him. He ended this very concerning story with saying that he realized that you never know what day is going to be your last. It was at that point that I realized the entire time he had been fiddling with his hands in his hoodie pocket because he had a knife. I screamed run, and without hesitation my husband grabbed my hand and we started running for our lives. In those first few moments of taking off, he asked me what was going on, and I screamed "Flowers don't growl" and started sobbing. This man had never taken the flashlight off of us, mind you, had it on one of his hands by his hoodie pocket the whole encounter. So we knew that he was chasing us when the flashing became erratic again, shining up and down over us. I'll never forget watching our shadows go from big to small from the movement of his hand while running hard. I looked back to see him behind us with the same smile that he had in the beginning, and it absolutely terrified me. We had to cut through some woods because he was gaining on us so fast, and in the heat of the moment decided to just continue through the woods back to the police instead of staying on the road that we would come up to after cutting through. We both looked back and last saw him right at the edge of the road where we would have come out if we had decided to take that way, because it would have been the fastest to the wreck. And seeing that, we knew that we had made the right decision immediately, and knew that it was a life or death situation in that moment. It clicked for us that he had expected us to take the road, and looked disappointed that we had taken the longer route instead. But we didn't see the flashlight or him after we looked forward again, and when we told the police, they did go, but they failed to find the guy. Fast forward a couple of years after this traumatic experience, and dozens of unsuccessful follow-up calls to see if they ever found him, I decided to post something on TikTok about it. It actually went viral overnight, and by the next day, someone who had lived in the area had actually found this guy, and shared a news article. He killed 2 weeks later at another campsite not too far from where we went. He attacked and stabbed a man who died immediately, and a woman who luckily survived, but only by playing dead. When I tell you finding this out absolutely sent me into a spiral, man do I mean it. I cannot even remotely begin to describe the mixed emotions of getting closure from him having been found, to the heartbreak and survivor's guilt of knowing that he went on to successfully kill because he wasn't caught after our experience. This changed my life. I'll never be able to enjoy camping again, and we used to love it. Look, please, for the love of all that is good, always go camping or hiking protected. It turns out that camping and hiking and murders are scarily common and seem to be a free-for-all to all serial killers. I mean, really, just look up camping cold cases and you'll be blindsided by just how common it all is. From age 13 until almost 15, I actually had a paper route. I delivered papers to people's doors 6 days a week. All of my customers, aside from occasional grumps and chatterboxes, were absolutely wonderful. Most of them were older, and so many of them were so happy to see me every day, just to have someone to talk to. Many of them would leave me granola bars, water bottles, and even tips at times. Winter holidays were a great time too, because everyone who could left huge tips for me. It was a genuinely pretty good first official job. Eventually, some of the snowbirds moved back and became my customers. One couple, Louise and Gerald, would always stick out in my mind. They started off normal, pretty friendly people, but I noticed one Sunday, the only day that I had to get up early to deliver papers, that Gerald was outside. He chatted me up, which was nothing unusual, and because it was so early and because I'd usually go right to bed after I was done, I was wearing a Britney Spears shirt and a pair of polar bear pajama pants. He complimented and said that I dressed cutely. I was confused, though, because, well, it was pajamas that I just threw on randomly. I guess I was confused by the compliment, but I just went on about my day and didn't think much of it. Something else to note, too, is that his wife, Louise, was always smiling. I couldn't pinpoint why, but it always unnerved me. In retrospect, it gives me the meek and mild and sort of subservient tradwife vibe. Anyway, I had noticed that in their garden, there were 3 different dog headstones that all said Fido on it. I was kind of confused as to why they all had the same name, but I figured maybe multiple people had bought them and they wanted to be polite, so they put them out anyways. Now one day, Louise was out and she had a dog with her. She introduced the dog to me, as they had just adopted her, and guess what? They named her Fido. All of the dogs that they had had were named Fido apparently, and they were all Shelties, just like that one. I thought that this was a bit weird, and I told my mum about it, and she told me not to be so judgmental, as it was probably one way that they dealt with grief. Here's the thing though, they kept trying to get me to come inside. They'd invite me in for tea, which is not really something people do where I'm from. Coffee and donuts is a little more commonplace, but even that isn't something that people do on a regular basis or anything. Or they'd invite me in to talk to them. I'd always decline politely because I had more papers to deliver anyway, and I wanted to go home. Gerald kept complimenting my outfits, even when they were just pajamas. And one morning, he did this while getting closer to me, and eventually touched my shoulder, and I was eventually like, I gotta go, and I left. I didn't tell my mum at the time, as our relationship was good at that point, and I feared that telling her of any concerns that I had would make her not trust me or make her mad or something. This was also at the tail end of my CSA, which she doesn't really know about to this day, and I thought that maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, right before I moved and I gave up my paper route, a really bizarre incident happened. It was a Sunday, the last Sunday that I had the paper route to be exact. So I was out early delivering papers, like it was still kind of dark out, and Gerald was outside. He complimented my outfit again, getting all creepily close. He invited me inside, and I said, I really don't think my mum would appreciate me being gone for longer than she expects me to. She's really strict, you know. Which wasn't the whole truth, but, I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do, right? He seemed to get kind of annoyed by that, though, and just asked, wouldn't your mum just prefer that you respect your elders and not turn down an invitation? And at that, I felt the color drain from my face, and I noped out of that really quick. I think I muttered something about how I really had to hurry along because my dog was sick or something. I heard him say some compliments about how my hair looked pretty. I have very wavy, sort of curly hair that gets very puffy and voluminous when I'm in the humidity, and he would bring that up a lot, saying that my hair reminded him of the 80s. In any case, I booked it as quickly as I could to the next house without running. I didn't see Gerald after that, but I did see Louise, and she never stopped inviting me to come inside and play with Fido or to have some tea. I always declined, and she always seemed disappointed every time. And so, that's my weird paper route story. I know that maybe I'm just being paranoid, but Gerald and Louise, they just gave me some really funky vibes. And looking back, I really hope that those graves did actually contain old pets. I recently went on a date with a guy from my school who I met on a dating app. He seemed super sweet and charming over text, so I agreed to go on a date with him, especially after two friends told me that they knew him from a class where he was genuinely a funny guy. Well, we go to a small, pretty prestigious university, which also made me sure that he would be normal. He was supposed to meet me at 6 to go out on a picnic, but ended up picking me up at about 8:30. He texted me to reschedule to 8 and ended up showing up at that time too. He drove me to his apartment, and although uncomfortable, I agreed to go in because of everything that I already knew about him. The apartment was only lit with one candle, and a small glowing light on the floor, which didn't really add much. It was a multiple bedroom apartment that he lived in alone, which made it even more odd, I guess. In any case, we talked and ate some food, and he seemed sort of nervous and uneasy for most of it. He suddenly switched the conversation to our deepest, darkest secrets, and asked if I had ever seriously thought about killing anyone. After I said no, he made up a story about being in the Navy and having to bomb a ship and killing 5 people. When I was unsure how to respond, he sort of just passed it off as a joke and said that he had seriously thought about killing someone else, his ex's current boyfriend allegedly. I was extremely uncomfortable at this point and wanted to leave, and he agreed to drive me home. Before we left though, he said that he wanted to show something to me and pulled out a rifle that he pointed in my direction. When I got startled, he remained eerily calm and said that he got it for hunting but couldn't think of even killing an animal. We left and I got back to my friend's place safely. Now, everyone I've told this has been flabbergasted about how the date went, and I just cannot shake the feeling that something was off about him, and it's creeping me out. To clarify too, I mean like something more sinister about him. So, if you have any thoughts, then it would be much appreciated. A series of events unfolded in my life, causing me to move out and live out of my car ever since about a month ago. It's nothing really new for me, however, as I've lived out of my car for 5 years prior in the past, and have never had any encounters. Until yesterday, that is, because something happened which really shook me up. There's this small beach on the coastline, which has been my go-to sleeping spot for some time. On the southbound part of the road is a whole lineup of cars and RVs, mainly other homeless, but also people coming to hang out because it offers a nice view of the bay. I usually sleep on this side, and the people who come here like to bring their beers, play their music, and gather outside, but it's super chill and everyone keeps to themselves for the most part. Well, lately I've been having trouble sleeping, and I tend to knock out at around 2 a.m.-ish, not waking up till noon. The problem is, though, on the southbound side, is that the sun will bear down at like 8 a.m., turning my car into a sauna in the morning. But about 100 yards down, on the northbound side, there's this tiny hiking trail area in the vast lot just off the road, and there's a few trees there which offer me a bit of shade until the afternoon. There's also a park right across the street from here. It's a much more secluded area, but I've been sleeping there since the last week or so, no issues at all. In fact, typically, only a couple of other cars really park around this area. So, yesterday, I pulled up to my spot at around 12:30 in the morning and found this large 4x4 pickup truck parked there. There's another car parked across the road and a third one on the other end of the lot as well. I think to myself, no biggie, there's a second tree just in front of the pickup which works for me, so I'll pull up there. It's only a 20-foot distance between us, and I am in their direct line of vision. I realize now in hindsight that it was probably a stupid move, but oh well. There's 2 people in the front seat playing their ranchero music, and there's also a dog left outside on a leash, possibly others in the back seat, but I couldn't confirm due to the windows being tinted. I never make eye contact and keep my head down the entire time. I first go to take a leak in the forest, come back to grab my pillows and blanket from the trunk, and hop into the back seat. I'd assume that they would have thrown off any paranoia that they would have had as they see that I'm just coming to sleep in for the night. Within 5 minutes, though, they take off and drive up the road for a short distance before suddenly making a U-turn and returning back into the lot. They do some weird random driving in front of me, then pull back slowly and very close to my side. I roll down my window. The passenger has his window all the way down. He's asking me something in Spanish and his English is basically nil. He's clearly drunk, coked up, bloodshot eyes, pupils dilated, and talking in a slight slur. He's also visibly angry, expressing intimidation via body language. I respond to him in English, so he asks if I'm Policia, and I'm like, "No man, I'm just sleeping here." I show him the pillow and the blanket, but he keeps pressing me. No, police come here." I reply, "No man, police no come here. Never, don't worry about it." I tuck my hand under my head as per the universal sign language of sleeping, again reiterating that I'm here to sleep. But he's getting frustrated and asks where I'm coming from. I'm trying my best to de-escalate the situation and talk calmly and nicely and even apologize if I happen to bother them. I directly asked him, "Do you think that I'm police?" And he responds in the negative, shaking his head. I point up to the tree and explain, "Shade for the morning, my car," just so that he knows why I decided to park in this spot. But he's pretending not to understand me and says, "Policia come here." Again, I tell him, "No man, police don't come here. I sleep here every night, it's okay." But the dude is angry now and starts halfway flashing something in his hand from behind the car door. It was a very subtle gesture, and I could not say for sure if it was a gun, but he was definitely suggesting something. He then says, "After today, no more sleeping here," repeating this 2 times, then goes, okay, while pumping his chest and piercing his gaze in a menacing fashion. The driver floors the gas pedal, taking off in a frenzy. As they're taking off, the passenger dude hangs out the window looking back and mugging the living heck out of me before they get back on the road, hitting the accelerator at high speeds. I sat there for a good 10 minutes just so that I don't run into them a second time, then went to sleep near a Walmart instead. I didn't get their license plate, but since they likely also have my plate and know what I look like, it'd probably turn sour for me if I reported them anyway. I spent the whole day dwelling on what had happened yesterday and have little clue as to what made them trip out like this. My only plausible theory is that they didn't like me parking proximally to them and they took it as a disrespect. In any case, it's a bit of a bummer because, well, there goes my perfect parking spot. So I was camping with a couple of friends at a spot on the McLeod River called Adena. If you haven't been, it's a pretty neat spot but very remote. McLeod town is small and Adena is about 14 miles into the woods, 7 of which are a rocky dirt road into a canyon with a beautiful pristine opal blue river at the bottom. The site was an old summer pack-in camp for a wealthy San Francisco family in the 1800s. There are still foundations of the buildings, an old chimney and the remnants of an orchard even. Now, the campground is right on the river and we went, as most do, to fly fish. It was early spring and the river was really too full and fast to do much useful fishing on this trip, which is likely why we were the only people down there. Anyway, on the first day there after no luck fishing, my buddy and his wife decided to take a snooze in their camper, so I walked up the river a bit to try and find a spot to fish where maybe the river wouldn't widen out and be more workable. I walked through the old ruins and through the orchard before finding a trail to head upriver. I fished unsuccessfully for about 45 minutes, and it started to rain a little bit, so I packed up and headed back. Right as I was coming off the trail, though, and back into the orchard area, there was an archway of vegetation that I had to duck a bit under to get through to get back into the old orchard. And right as I ducked in, I heard, coming through the dense foliage, a few feet above my head and no more than 10 feet, what sounded like a horse pushing air out through its cheeks. It was a deep guttural sound from a large animal, and it sounded close enough to almost touch it. I could see nothing though because the vegetation was so dense, but I got real cold real fast and moved out of the thick stuff into the more open orchard. And then I froze. I could hear nothing. I couldn't see anything in the brush. I was kicking myself because I was carrying a sidearm, but it was in my pack, which I was an idiot for doing that. Slowly though, I took off my pack, put it on the ground, and I got my gun. I put on my shoulder harness and packed back on as slow and easy as I possibly could, the whole time intensely focused on the sound, but I didn't hear anything. This orchard is about the size of a football field, and the right side of which, where the sound had come from, is dense blackberries. So basically there's this open space, then the dense woods and the berry area where you can't really see much. I started walking back through the orchard towards our campsite, At the opposite end had a similar kind of dense arch-like spot to get out of the orchard and back into the ruin or campground area. I had made considerable ground and was intensely listening for sounds of something following me and had heard nothing. And as I made my way, I was starting to feel like I was in the clear. And right as I let a little bit of a sigh of relief out while going through the exit arch, there was that same sound from a similar height, and just as close as before. At that, I instantly broke into a full sprint the rest of the way back to the campsite, and informed my friends quickly. It was honestly a really wild experience, and as I was running, I felt like my life depended on it. Anyway, that night we all decided to stay down there in any case, and yeah, as we were cooking and eating, a deer showed up. The strange part was that as it got darker, the deer kept getting closer. By the time that we were ready for bed, it was literally under the picnic table in the campsite. We had a pretty uneventful night for the most part, but when we got up in the morning, the deer had slept under the pop-up camper right at the door. The next day, we went back to the orchard with our firearms ready. I was determined to figure out how the animal had moved without me hearing it through the dense berries. I searched, and in the end, I just could not come up with a rational explanation. I mean, there were no paths, no trails. But lastly, and most disconcerting, in the middle of the orchard there was a small pine tree, maybe about 12 feet tall. But the weird part was that something had broken the top off of it, about 7 feet up, and laid it across the vague footpath that I had just used to get through the orchard the day before. And I can assure you that it was not there then. I've racked my head trying to make sense of this encounter for some time now. I mean, a bear obviously comes to mind, but what I get stuck in is the height of where the sound came from. Black bears getting to like 9 feet tall is not really a thing, and an animal that size, having to move pretty quickly to cut me off, does not seem possible over that distance through that thick of the brush without a trail. I'm a touch over 6 feet as well, and this noise was a few feet above my head. The terrain just would not have accounted for that, plus a bear standing up. Impossible. The other thing too is that I just don't understand how it could have cut me off at the other exit and made no sound getting there through the dense berries and the trees like that. I was absolutely terrified, and I don't think I've ever been listening more intensely in my life, but there was just no sound. I mean, I guess it could have been 2 huge bears, one at each spot, but I've never heard a bear make those sounds before. The deer issue was also really strange. That animal seemed really spooked and felt safe by us, and I've never seen that before. Anyway, it's a cool spot, and if I was Bigfoot, that's where I would be, considering the orchard food source and limited humans for the majority of the year. I'm not saying it was that by any means. Really, I have no idea what it was, but I'm sort of convinced now that there was something weird going on there, for sure. So my family and our friend, 1 male, 2 female, our kid a newborn, just went on a walk through a trail near our friend's dad's house. What was supposed to be a nice outing started to get strange though when a group of what felt like 40, but was probably more like 20, walked past us, most of them wearing the color white. We just think of this as a bit strange, but we continue through the path anyways. But then, all of them, instead of leaving, decide to turn around and start catching up and walking behind us. Now, I've walked this trail often enough to know the general area, but we get a bit spooked amid their group's excitement, and decide to walk into a path that's not really a trail, but we can hide behind. We wait for a bit, hearts racing, and I hear a small group on a path above us that would have ended up leading them to cutting us off halfway through the trail. I specifically heard them say something in a sort of questioning manner as well, and about the 4 of them. We continue waiting a bit until the group on the main path passes, and then we quickly head back the way that we had come and safely got away. This obviously just happened, and I'm still convincing myself that we were just overthinking it, but we had actual fear, and the whole situation felt very strange, especially because, well, they cut us off the trail, and honestly, the way they were dressed, they looked like, I don't know, maybe a cult. I, a 22-year-old female, had a very horrible experience about 2 or 3 years ago. So my boyfriend, 22 and male, and I had been dating for less than a year when this happened. My partner is of a Latino descent and I'm white. My boyfriend's family are believers of the bracelets of the evil eye. They taught me that the evil eye in their culture is used for protection, like if someone gives you a bad look or if they look at you with bad intent or envy. They then taught me that if the bracelet becomes lost or broken, that means that the bracelet has done its job and protected you. Now, my partner and I were hanging out one day at his home and he came across an old evil eye bracelet that used to belong to him. He had lost the bracelet some time before, and he asked me if I wanted it, and he said that it would protect me. From what I understand, someone can gift you their evil eye bracelet, and it should protect you still, even though it had a previous wearer. So I accepted my boyfriend's offer and decided to wear the bracelet, but I didn't really believe in that stuff, I guess. I mean, I grew up Christian and I still believe in God to this day, and am fairly religious, but not any of that sort of superstitious stuff. In any case, I went home later that day, and I was living with my aunt and uncle at the time. My aunt and uncle are very hardcore religious sort of folks, and so their house felt beyond safe most of the time. I never got any bad energy or negative feelings there, nor did I ever experience anything bad or paranormal too. That night though, I went to bed wearing the bracelet with nothing really in mind. I don't know how long I had been asleep for or what time I woke up, but I remember waking up screaming and thrashing. I can't remember any previous nightmare or dream prior to waking, but as I was waking myself up with my screaming and thrashing, I swear that I felt something grabbing my arm, the arm that I was wearing the bracelet on. I remember that I was grabbing my own arm as well as my other hand, almost as if I was trying to reinforce my other arm that was being grabbed and pulled. I think that I had managed to shake off whatever was grabbing me at the time because as I was really waking up, I suddenly felt something at the end of the bed, and with a hard tug, it tried to rip my blanket off of me. I held onto my blanket firmly and eventually, whatever it was, seemed to let go. I laid there in the pitch black darkness with my eyes wide open, just sort of staring at the ceiling until I felt like it was safe enough to grab my remote control that turned my LED light strips on and off. I turned on the lights and I saw nothing at all. I stayed awake for maybe 10 minutes just looking around and being on my phone, but eventually I was too tired and I fell asleep again. I really don't know how I was able to be honest, but I did, with the lights on of course. I had never ever experienced anything like this, and there's no way that I could have been asleep or dreaming still because I distinctly remember waking up screaming and sort of thrashing and absolutely feeling something. Now, I don't know if something had been attached to that bracelet or if it was just a crazy coincidence or not, but whatever the case, it was terrifying, and I didn't feel comfortable going home the next day to sleep in my own bed again. The bracelet remained in my home, but I had taken it off for a shower and I didn't put it back on after that. And I never experienced anything again like that, even though the bracelet remained in my home and in my jewelry dish. So, if any of you practice witchcraft or are into the paranormal and culturally practice the evil eye stuff, I would really like to hear your thoughts or speculations as to what you think could have happened. I live alone in a studio, and to make it feel bigger, I separate the end of my mattress that isn't facing the wall with a big tapestry, sort of like a hospital curtain, I guess. I was about to go to sleep and was laying down in my bed on my phone. I wasn't listening to any music or anything, and after like 20 minutes of lights out and laying down, I hear this panting right on the other side of my tapestry. It sounded like when a dog, sniffing really hard with its snout, is all up in a jar or whatever. I turned on my flashlight without getting up first to just see if maybe an animal or something got in. I even said get out twice and the panting continued. But after that, it almost seemed like they got more dragged out and breathy between pants. I also then started hearing shifting and almost like skittering over into my kitchen and bathroom area, also conveniently out of my sight. Eventually, I got up and turned on the lights and it all just sort of stopped, except for occasional house settling or rustles now and then. And of course, nothing was there. Nothing was out of place. I couldn't see any pests around or anything. But I definitely slept with the lights on that night, to say the least. We live in Australia, and for one of my birthdays years ago, pre-kid life, my husband booked an Airbnb cabin on a property in a rainforest area about 2 hours from our home. This was a property where the owners lived on a few acres and had 3 cabins in various spots, was bordering a national park. The rainforest is one of the oldest remaining in the world and is on the World Heritage List. It was a modest little 1-bedroom cabin close to the main house, styled very vintage-like. No Wi-Fi or internet or even TV. We just enjoyed pottering around the rainforest and the beautiful creeks for the first day and night. It was nice and peaceful, but it did have a bit of an odd vibe to it, I'll give it that. Well, the second night was not so peaceful. That night I noticed it was eerily quiet, like dead, absolute quiet. Not a single insect or bird even making a noise. It was not natural for a wildlife area, and I sort of felt watched and on edge a little. But I didn't think too much of it, and we went to bed as usual. But later that night, I have this vivid dream that standing at the end of my bed was this ghastly thin old lady in a nightgown, grinning at me with this evil grin, with wide eyes, and she claws up at me to grab me. I wake up horrified and instantly look over at my husband. He is already awake, and he appears, well, terrified for lack of a better word. He asks if I'm okay and what's wrong. I say it's nothing. I keep staring at the end of the bed, and so does he. We put the bathroom light on to sleep that night, and neither of us discussed why. Neither one of us sleeps, and we spend a horrible night basically waiting for dawn, and we leave shortly afterward. Now, on the drive home, I asked him why he was awake and that he looked so scared. And he told me that he couldn't sleep because he just couldn't shake the feeling that something was at the end of the bed and watching us. I asked what he thought it was, and he told me that he kept seeing like a creepy, vague outline of an old woman. I hadn't yet told him about my dream, and then I told him, and we were very weirded out, and now refer to it as our haunted cabin holiday. So, we've lived in the same new mobile home, manufactured trailer house, for 2 years on land that my husband's family has owned for almost 100 years. And well, lately, weird things have been happening. The other day, my husband and I were talking as I was walking out of our bedroom. The light was on and he was walking inside of it. Then he said my name in a slightly sort of concerning tone. I turned around and said, "What?" But the light was suddenly off. Hubby asked, "Did you turn the light off when you walked out?" I shook my head confused. "No, did you?" "No, I was getting undressed by the closet." Which meant that the switch had somehow been flipped. Our 6-year-old was in the other room and our 2-year-old can't reach up that high. So we just sort of look at each other like, what the actual heck? The fact that this happened isn't the most concerning part though. You see, the other night, I was sitting on the couch close to midnight, scrolling through my phone when I heard a noise like a flip of a switch. And sure enough, as I looked toward the hall bathroom light, which is usually on a nightlight for our 6-year-old, it was off. Then I hear it again, the flip of a switch, and the light cuts on. I stare at the hall absolutely flabbergasted as to what had happened. I never mentioned it to my husband because for all 6'2" and 240 pounds that he is, the man is definitely jumpy. And nothing like this has happened like it before in the 2 years of living here, but I'm 10 weeks pregnant with our second child. With my first pregnancy, I always felt like someone was always watching us or would hear footsteps walking down the hall of our old home. I had nightmares of someone snatching my husband away. His mother had recently passed when I was 18 weeks pregnant with our first kid. Maybe I'm being sensitive in this pregnancy, but this is the first time my husband and I witnessed something like this together. So, what do you guys think? Back in 2021, my husband and I went on a couples trip with a group of 8 other friends to the mountains of Gatlinburg, Tennessee for the weekend. We drove the 4 hours, made it to the cabin, and got all settled in. While we were waiting for the last couple to arrive, who were bringing their kids, we ended up deciding not to wait and go out to dinner about 20 minutes up the road from our cabin. We took 2 cars, me, A, my husband M, L and J in mine, and Z, E, D, and C in the other. Z, E, D, and C left ahead of us, and we trailed behind. I was driving a 2011 Subaru Outback at the time, and my phone was mounted on one of those cabin fan blowers. We were chatting, having a great time catching up, listening to music on low. Halfway to the restaurant, we get a call from our friend Y. I turn the music down, I hit accept on the call with everyone in the car yelling their hellos, and all of a sudden we hear a woman screaming, crying and pleading, "No, stop, don't do this," with more crying, screaming and begging as we immediately all fell silent. Everyone in the car flies into a panic. Me and my husband, we were scrambling to put the phone on speaker, everyone yelling out her name. Then the screaming cuts off, like the call just ended, and our friend Y comes through the phone, calm and collected with a, "Hey guys, we just made it to the cabin." We are still yelling and asking her if she's okay, and she responds in a confused voice that they're all fine, and that they just made it in but needed the door code. We explained to her that we had just heard crying and screaming, and we thought that she was getting murdered or attacked, to which she let us know that, no, we're doing fine. Her kids aren't freaking out, and they're doing great too. We give her the code and finish up the call in shock, and, we all heard that. It sounded too real, and Y has never been one to play games like that. The rest of the car ride, we're all freaked out and trying to rationalize the whole thing, to think of what or who that could have possibly been. In the parking lot, explaining the weird occurrence to our friends who made it there before us, an ambulance drives by with its siren and lights on, back the way that we had just come. So could it have been a weird frequency that we picked up on somebody actually getting hurt? Did something hijack the phone call? Well, whatever it was, it thoroughly freaked us all out, and our explanation is, well, maybe it was paranormal. So my buddy and I, who were in college at the time, we were back in our little hometown for the weekend. That Saturday night, we were driving around getting high and just drinking beer. We were driving around on dark country roads and it was pitch black that night, overcast with no moon. We stopped on a dirt road to take a bit of a leak and roll another joint. My buddy who was driving left the car running but turned the lights off. We didn't see any other cars or people around us for like miles, but my buddy starts rolling the joint and the overhead light inside the car is on. Then he happens to glance up toward the front of the car, acts startled, and flips on the headlights. We look out the car windows and see a whole group of guys around the car. We both yelled some choice words, he slammed the car into gear, and we hauled butt out of there. Those guys, they were probably people that we knew from town. I even thought that I recognized one of them, but I've always wondered what in the heck they were doing out in the middle of nowhere like that, on a pitch black night, without flashlights and apparently on foot, and then surrounding our car like that. I've never been one to really believe in the paranormal. Not that I often wondered about supernatural phenomenon outside of seeking a good scare now and then, like on YouTube or whatever, but I always assumed that what I was watching were either good hoaxes or had some logical explanation that wasn't immediately apparent to me. That was, until this past weekend, when myself and my girlfriend had an unexplainable appearance. Funny how that works, right? Complete disbeliever until an encounter of your own. Well, we were staying in an Airbnb in Belfast, Northern Ireland, with it being a small townhouse in a council estate. The upstairs, where our bedroom was separated from a second bedroom by a tiny landing. Upon waking up on Friday, the 13th, we started getting ready for the day. I was sat at the end of the bed pulling my socks on when I looked up and I saw a human shadow on the curtain of the bedroom across the landing from us. Not realizing what it was yet, I made a remark about how that wasn't creepy at all, and my girlfriend peered around the corner to see what I was talking about. "Oh" was the only thing she could muster up in response to me. Seeing that she was unsettled, I marched into the second bedroom and pulled back the curtain to see what was casting the shadow, thinking that it was going to be something silly like a tribute to Queen Lizzie stuck on the window, but there was nothing there. It was also the second story, so I wasn't expecting to see an actual person peering in or anything, but I wasn't expecting to see nothing at all. Also, there was nothing outside that could have cast that shadow. I pulled the curtain back into position thinking, that's weird, and the shadow was still there. Still in a state of somewhat disbelief, I walked back to the doorframe to see if it was my shadow, but my shadow didn't even come close to reaching the curtain. With the pair of us completely creeped out, we went back to our room to get ready to get out of the house for the day as quickly as we could. My girlfriend peered back around the corner when we were almost finished to discover that the shadow was still there but had now shifted to the left. After that, we threw the rest of our clothes on, and when we looked again, it was completely gone. We have no idea how long it was there watching us, but from the moment that we became aware of it, it was gone within about 5 minutes. The second and last night that we slept there, we slept with the door closed, which we hadn't the first night, and it wasn't there the following morning. My girlfriend thinks that it's because we slept with the door closed the second night that it didn't show up as it couldn't watch us. Personally, I struggled with finding an explanation for it, but there's just really nothing logical about it. There was nothing there that could have casted it, and it was still there when I pulled the curtain back into position, which was really strange. I mentioned this whole thing to our Airbnb host, but they didn't seem to register any recognition of it. We're both absolutely certain about what we saw, though, and from looking up shadow people, it seems like it is a phenomena that people experience. But can anyone give us any sort of reason as to why this shadow person visited us of all people? Thanks for listening. About 20 years ago, I had one of the most perplexing things happen to me while I was out having a cigarette. It was about 2 a.m. and I had woken up in the middle of the night. After tossing and turning, I just could not get back to sleep that night, so I decided to go out and have a smoke. For reference, I live in an apartment with a small cement patio out front. It's on a very busy street, with a sidewalk that runs alongside of it. While the street was loud and busy during the day, it was actually very peaceful to sit out there at night. All my neighbors were sleeping and the night was cool and calming. Anyway, while I was sitting on my patio steps, a large dark-colored animal came into view from a distance. It was walking on the sidewalk, and for some reason my freeze response kicked in. I became a brick and the hair on my arms was raised. While it walked slowly toward me, I tried to make out what kind of animal it was. It was easily as big as a horse. I do know that sometimes people walk their horses around town, even though this is a large city, but there was no rider on this creature. Is it an escaped horse? The closer it got, though, the more confused I was. Honestly, it resembled a large black panther or maybe a lion-bear hybrid or something. It had black fur that was kind of wavy or curly. I could see the steam from its breathing, and the crazy thing is that it did not seem to be aware of my presence at all. Maybe that's why I stayed frozen, letting my cigarette burn out completely. It was almost like I knew if I moved that it would kill me. My body did eventually let me move, but I must have been out there for a good 30 minutes, scared out of my mind to move. Honestly, I don't know that much about these things, but I feel like I saw something that I wasn't supposed to see that night. I feel like it was from a different dimension or something, and I just got a bit of a peek. I've had a few paranormal type encounters, and another perplexing glitch that happened recently. It always feels the same too, like I'm just getting a bit of a glimpse behind the veil or something. But please, tell me someone out there, somebody else has seen this creature. It also haunted me more than any other unexplained experience that I've had. I've tried talking about it with other people, and they usually just say something patronizing like, wow, that's crazy, and really, that's about it. So my wife and I purchased an 1890s Queen Anne Victorian several years ago, and we're slowly restoring it for a traditional B&B as a part of our retirement plan in like another 10 to 15 years. My wife found one written account of a ghostly encounter following our initial, individual and personal experiences, which is not really what you want to find when you're trying to explain away an experience. There's every reason to believe that the original owners passed away in this house, and subsequent to that, it's my understanding that somebody died in the house and the body was dumped in a water well that is now covered in a mid-century addition to the original structure. Think Social Security fraud. The FBI ultimately dug up the body from the well, and that's when they found it there. My own experiences have been, well, fairly limited, I guess, and mostly what the heck sort of oriented. My first awareness was the sound of someone or something walking toward me. which I attributed to our large dog possibly following me upstairs, but she was downstairs and behind a closed door when I later checked. My wife described similar experiences within the main area of focus being at the top of the stair landing. She has a practice of singing or humming a tune as she comes down the stairs, and she believes that this either interrupts the experience or at least distracts her from the experience. I normally follow this musical practice too, whistling a tune that we sometimes sing to our dogs or singing an old jingle or whatever. I was home alone this evening and I needed to go upstairs to my study or lair to grab something. It was a long day and I had a few pressing things on my mind, so instead of singing or whistling, I was thinking about a work conversation from earlier. As I was coming downstairs, I heard footsteps following me down, a different tempo and rhythm than my cadence. I slowed and thought about turning to look, but I quickly noped out, only briefly looking up as I made the 180 turn at the bottom of the stairs and headed toward the kitchen. I didn't see anything, but I could definitely feel like something was near me. I didn't feel like I was clear of the presence too until I passed into the new section of the house. The hair on the back of my neck and arms had still not settled down an hour later. I had to go back up to the front of the house briefly to check for mail, and now that feeling that I generally have only at the top of the stairs is just on the other side of that kitchen door. Whatever it is, I think it's followed me down the stairs and it's decided to stay there. It just doesn't feel right or safe to speak about it inside this house too, and so I refuse to talk about it in the house. Texting my wife about it or sharing it here feels safe, but if you and I had talked about this whole thing before tonight, then I would have said that I do believe that there is something there, but it's not anything bad. Now, I'm really not so sure. This whole situation seems ridiculous, I know. I know that tomorrow in the daylight I'll probably feel less anxious about it. Well, probably. This was about 5 years ago when I was 11. I remember I was on my way home from school. It was a little late because my train had gotten delayed about 2 times, but that didn't bother me. I remember that it was a Friday and really I had nothing to do anyway. As I got home, I received a text from my angry mother. I had no clue why she was so mad, but she was texting me some crazy nonsense and somehow put the blame on me and proceeded to end the text with, "I'm not cooking, I left $70 on your desk, go buy something to eat and drink." So that's exactly what I did. By the time that I had gotten home, I changed my clothes, went outside and walked to a gas station, which was only about maybe a quarter of a mile away from me. I've always walked to this gas station either by myself, with my older brother, or with another guardian. So honestly, I thought that it would be no big deal to go by myself because I was always so hyper-vigilant about my surroundings anyway. Anyway, as I got to the store, I saw this man inside the walk-in fridge where there was just a ton of beer. And as I was walking around the store to get some snacks, I noticed him staring at me a couple of times. It felt like I needed to be aware, but I brushed it off, just thinking that he was just making sure that I wasn't doing anything stupid. As I was paying off for the stuff at the counter, after being there for about 30 minutes, the same man is standing next to me, and it was at this point that I got scared. This man was tall, he looked a bit muscular, and his eyes were visibly dark. I know some people read hot romance novels, but when a man's eyes go dark, it's not attractive, it's terrifying. As my stuff was getting put into the bag and as the pizza was done, I picked up my pizza and I left. But then the man decides to have a conversation with me. He greets me with a hello. I greet him with a very clear, scared and shaky hi. He started asking me questions like, "How old are you?" I replied back with my age, stating that I was 11. I try walking home around the other way around, but he keeps stopping me in my tracks, and as I was just thinking of all the terrible possibilities if I screamed, ran, or let alone hit him with my bare hands to have him leave me alone, as I stated my age, I noticed his eyes widen even more, and he proceeded to look me up and down, where he asked, "Are you by any chance healthy?" And he asked me some other odd questions, telling me things like, "What alcohol do you like?" I stayed quiet and I just told him that I don't drink. And he started asking me more alarming questions like, "Did you know that you can live without a kidney?" At this point, I had to play dumb for a bit. I replied with something stupid like, "No, that's nice actually." It got to the point where he started asking if he could give me a ride home, and I declined his offer more than 20 times. Until finally, he gave up, left me alone all agitated, and I sped walked home. It wasn't until the following next year that I saw him again at the mall, and I was terrified. I refused to go to that mall because I don't ever want to bump into that guy ever again. There was something off about him. Something really off. Even though this was almost 10 years ago now, I've never been able to get this out of my head, so I thought that I would post it here. So I was about 11 or 12 years old, living in an apartment with my mum. Right across from our apartment was a very creepy neighbor. I could write whole books about all the creepy, wild, and downright insane things that he said and did throughout the 2 years that he was our neighbor. But this was something that always stuck with me more than anything else. You see, my mum and this neighbor were having a casual conversation with each other, with my mum's goal being to try to find some common ground with him and clear up any misunderstandings or miscommunications that may have led him to dislike us so much, as he had a pretty blatant feeling of disdain toward us. That much was clear. But evidently something went wrong during this conversation, as my mum suddenly came stomping into our apartment, loudly shutting and locking the door. She was visibly upset and shaken, so I asked what was wrong. Her voice trembling, she said that our neighbor said this, completely unprompted. He said, "You know, if I were you, I'd keep your daughter away from guys like me." Now, while I will never know exactly what he meant by this, my mind definitely had plenty of ideas of what he actually meant. At the very least, it felt like a thinly veiled threat. And the worst part was that I was often home alone, as I did online school while my mum went to work. So from then on, I never felt safe when I was home alone, as my imagination ran wild on what he might end up doing to me. Now, I never thought that I would say this kind of thing, and I feel kind of guilty about it, but thankfully he ended up dying before he ever did follow through on his creepy comment. Also, before anyone asks, my mum only told me about this because she wanted to warn me to stay the heck away from this guy, and to never do anything like keep the door unlocked or anything like that. And I can tell you that she didn't have to tell me twice. So quite honestly, I really don't even know what to call this, what I saw or what it was. I really want to believe that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was around 7 when this happened. I'm from a South Asian island nation, and personally I still don't like to believe in anything that I cannot physically see or explain. So when I was about 6, we had to move to this old estate house surrounded by a rubber tree plantation. Money was tight and my dad worked out of town. The place was definitely a little bit creepy, isolated, gloomy, tall rubber trees blocking the sun, but to me it was just home. It didn't feel scary, at least not at first. Now, during monsoon season, the storms here can get pretty intense, and power outages were super common. One of these days, the power went out again. My mum turned on our emergency flashlight and lit a few candles around the house, mostly in the living room and her bedroom. Me and my sister were hanging out in my mum's room, staying out of the dark, just playing around. I got bored and I decided to grab one of our car magazines from my room. My mum used to buy me these all the time, and I didn't bother taking a candle or a flashlight or anything. I knew the house well enough, and the moonlight coming through the trees gave just enough visibility. I went into my room, picked up the magazine, and for some reason I looked out the window, and that was when I saw it. 2 glowing red eyes. Not just glowing, but they looked like shiny glass marbles, deep red, unmoving and just staring. They were only a few feet away from the window. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It was like I was frozen. I didn't see any other features, just the eyes, and suddenly they rushed toward the window. Fast, too. Like inhumanely fast. That snapped me out of it quickly. I ran screaming to my mum's room, completely freaked out. I couldn't speak properly for about 10 to 20 minutes. I tried to tell my mother and sister what I saw, but they didn't believe me. said that I must have seen an animal or was just imagining things. Eventually, the whole memory sort of faded away, and I just kind of pushed it into the back of my mind, I guess. Until recently. So, a few weeks ago, I'm 27 now, by the way, I went to visit my dad at his place. It's the family home, old as heck, like over 100 years old, big and kind of beautiful, but honestly a little bit creepy. My aunt came over too, just to hang out since I hadn't seen her for a while. We ended up having a little barbecue in the evening, had a couple of beers, and started reminiscing a bit. Somehow the topic shifted to creepy stuff. I casually told them the house always gave me the creeps. My dad brushed it off like, come on, it's just old. But then he randomly mentioned how he saw something with glowing red eyes when he was around 7. Same thing, pitch dark night, windy, and he saw this black figure with red eyes watching him. Said that it rushed up close, just like that. And I swear I almost had a panic attack when I heard this. It was exactly what happened to me, word for word almost, and I never told him about it. My mum never told him either. So I told him. The room suddenly went silent, and then my aunt, she just sat there for a second, then said, wait, Dad told me he saw something like that when he was a kid too. My grandfather apparently had a similar experience when he was around the same age as well, about 7-ish, same red eyes, same kind of encounter. None of us had ever talked about it before, and we didn't even know that we had each seen it. After that, we just kind of sat there in silence, all three of us agreeing to just chalk it up to our imagination. But I swear I could see it in their eyes. They were scared, like they knew that it was real, even if they didn't want to say it. But here's the weird part. Whatever it was, it never hurt any of us. It never tried to. It just showed itself, watched, and then disappeared. Almost like it just wanted to be seen. I still don't know what it was. I want to believe that it was just a hallucination or whatever, but now I'm honestly not so sure anymore. My wife and I were hiking on a particular trail at a nature preserve with our dog one day. We came across some people walking as well, almost like a family, I guess, but they seemed a bit, I don't know, off to me. They were friendly enough, I guess. They asked what kind of dog we had and how old he was, etc. We answered politely and tried to go our own way, but they tried to keep the conversation going. We politely continued until we eventually made our way toward the trail. About 3 minutes later, my wife and I were quiet, and she said to me, "Where did they come from? I didn't hear anyone behind us or ahead of us." So, to backtrack a bit here, this particular part of the trail bottlenecks, so you can see if anyone is coming from a good distance. Funny enough, she said, "Do you feel weird? Like someone's watching us, or like we're looking at us strangely or something?" I didn't say anything for a minute, and she asked, "Did you hear what I said?" I said, "Yeah, I did." "How did you know that?" She stopped, looked at me and said, "I felt the same thing." The hair stood on the back of my neck. All the while, our dog was walking very slowly with his head down, almost as if he sensed a predator but didn't know where it was coming from and was moving cautiously. We continued back to our car at a steady pace, and eventually we left. We come to find out that there have actually been several cases of people over the years living in those woods and showing up randomly on the side of the roads in the middle of the night, trying to stop cars for God knows what. The woods outside the trails are extremely dense and dangerous to traverse unless you have to and are a professional. Not many weird things have happened to me, and I don't easily scare, but I have never been back there. I feel like they were watching us, and they came out to test our reaction. I'm a pretty big dude, and I can handle myself pretty well, but it always stuck with me, this one. We could just sense that predators were watching us. I remember when my family freshly moved to our house about 12 to 13 years ago. Before we moved in, we went and looked at the house. We had just looked in the daylight basement, which was carpeted. It had a bedroom, a bathroom, a storage closet, and another connected closet that held the water heater. The bedroom had a closet which had 3 huge mirrors as doors. In the closet was a small door that connected to the water heater closet. Anyway, on our way back upstairs from touring, in the basement, my sister locked me in there, which had child lock hinges on the top and the bottom of the staircase door. They were on the outside, like they were either trying to keep a child from going down there, which made no sense for the bottom child lock hinge, but made the most sense for them, or like they were trying to keep something or someone downstairs. Either or, though, I got the most eerie vibe from this basement, like I wasn't alone in this completely empty space. Well, eventually, when we first moved in, my siblings and I kept finding bones just all over the property. The weird part about this was that whenever we found a bone, there was always a golf ball nearby. I remember finding one with carvings in it too, in another language hanging on one of our fences. My dad wrote them off as animal bones anytime that we found one, and eventually threw them all away. We found clothes in plastic bags around the property too that were mainly female clothes or male boxers, and those were thrown away too. There were a couple of nooses hanging loosely in a tree as well. Those were taken down and used for cattle. The tree was eventually cut down too. Anyway, a few years went by and a lot had happened. These are all things that my siblings and I experienced at this house. So I remember when I shared that basement room with my siblings, my bed was positioned in front of the closet doors at one stage. I had woken up but not moved yet, and there was a man crouched in front of me, just moving his head back and forth super fast, so I couldn't make out his face very well. I closed my eyes and he disappeared. After that, we would constantly hear footsteps going up and down the stairs at all hours of the day. I saw a man about the same stature as my dad go down the stairs, so I followed him. I believed I needed to ask him a question or something, and that's why, but the man I followed down the stairs had turned the corner to go into the back bedroom in the basement, and once I got to the corner, he just disappeared. No one was down there but me. My sibling had experienced this same thing too. It didn't stop there though. My little sister was cleaning the living room in the basement one day and was getting an eerie vibe from the back bedroom, so she went over and closed the bathroom door and the bedroom door. Once she walked back down the hall, she started cleaning up again when she noticed a few moments later the bedroom door had opened again. She immediately went right back upstairs, and that room eventually became my older sibling's room, and I remember one day she had mentioned that she was laying in bed and had just woken up to something opening her door. She claimed that she watched the handle turn and the door slowly open, but nothing was there. A few nights went by and all of my siblings and I were hanging out with her in her room when we heard a knock on the wall. Mind you, this wall was concrete and on the other side of this was a hill. So she knocked on the wall and whatever it was knocked back. It was the tune of Skunk in a Barnyard, if you've ever heard that. But after that, the room was then turned into my little sister's room. I went into the basement bedroom to tuck my little sister into bed for the night. I had tucked my little sister in on the lower bunk bed and gave her a kiss on the cheek goodnight. As I went up the ladder to give my older sister a kiss and tuck her in, that's when I saw both of them, up on her bed, sound asleep. I felt my stomach twist. As I went back down, I noticed the bottom bed was now empty. I immediately left the room. My dad eventually made a wall in the basement living room, splitting it into a bedroom and a living room. The bedroom portion was used as a playroom for a hot minute, and one of my older sisters had walked in there and saw my little sister playing with her toys, only to later realize that it wasn't my little sister in the room at all. The doors we would hear constantly opening and closing when no one was down there, the stairs were stepped on when nobody was there, and eventually my dad tore down the wall that he built, and after a few years, no one ever stayed in that basement. We also used to see ghost cars or people walk down into the field and just disappear without a trace. But we used to see a man walking his dog down in the field and just disappear all the time. Mind you, these happened over many years, and it wasn't all at once, obviously, but yeah, it all happened, and it was all very frightening. Eventually, most of the basement was renovated due to water damage. When my parents pulled up the carpet in the back bedroom, There was a clearly poorly done job of re-poured concrete about maybe 5 or 6 feet long and a couple of feet wide. It was very rough compared to the original concrete, but once that basement was renovated, the weird activity basically just diminished. All they did was take the carpet out and 2 of the mirror doors on the closet, and so really that doesn't make much sense to me, but not to mention that I've looked up this house address many times to see if anything had happened there, and to no avail. I couldn't find anything on the house or the property either, so I have no clue what any of the sinister activity was really about, and I guess it's just going to remain a mystery. Also, my dad never believed my siblings and I about these experiences, and to this day when we bring it up, he just sort of shrugs it off. He doesn't even remember the bones, the nooses, or the clothes that were thrown away all the time, but yeah, that's my dad for you, and that's just how he is. I'm sure that there's a lot more that I cannot remember, and no, I don't think anyone necessarily died here because I'm sure that there would be a record of that somewhere, but I do believe that maybe someone was doing something sinister in the house, like maybe witchcraft, or something was conjured up in the basement or something. Also, the concrete difference is more than likely nothing at all but a badly done repair job, but I thought that I would mention it because, honestly, who knows? So this was like a decade or so ago, but I've always wanted to know what this thing is. When I was 13, I was practicing a dance for my mum. I had a competition coming up and I was a younger member on the team. I didn't want to mess it up for anyone, so I made her watch me practice. Anyway, I was in the living room, which faced our backyard. We had a couple of windows that displayed the backyard in eyesight of where we were, and as I was doing this dance, I bent down, and when I popped back up, I saw a woman with dark hair and a white dress. She was really dirty as well. The dress was sleeveless, and her skin was so white or grey. Around her eyes was all black, as if she'd applied black eyeshadow all around them. You couldn't see her eyes, as they were also black and blended into the black ring around them. Her teeth looked sharp. All of her teeth looked sharp. She was just staring at me. I froze. I stared at her for what felt like a minute until my mum said, "What is it? What are you looking at?" She was panicked because, obviously, I just stopped all of a sudden and was just staring past her. Once she pulled my attention away from the woman, she was gone. I told my mum that I saw someone. She ran out into the backyard. She's not surviving a horror movie, by the way. And nobody was there. There weren't any signs of someone standing outside that window. There's a little garden right below it. It'd be very easy to tell if someone had been standing there, but there was nothing. She came back in and said that there was nothing there. She believes that I saw something, though, because she says that I went pale and was just sort of staring at the window. I'll add too that my house was between 2 cemeteries. The block our house was on was 1 street down both directions from the cemeteries. When my mum and dad first moved into it, she swears that there were ghosts there as well. She would hear whistling often, but nobody else was home. It unnerved her so badly that she had people come look at the house and cleanse it. But I don't know much about that. Every now and then, one of us would sort of catch a glimpse of a shadow or something, though. When my sister was a kid, she was terrified of a man in the drain, but none of us saw it besides her. My dad and brother don't believe in all that, but me, my mum, and my sister, we all swear that we've seen or heard things. I don't know if that's useful information to anyone, but I felt like it was relevant to add it. But none of us had ever really seen something in such a way as I did. I never saw the woman again, mind you, but I can picture her so clearly. It sent a chill down my spine, but I just couldn't look away from her. And honestly, as cliche as this sounds, she was like the ghost from The Ring or The Grudge, but a bit different. Like, The Ring or The Grudge aren't quite what she looked like, but they're kind of similar in regards to the white dress and the long black hair, I guess. I know that this sounds crazy, but I swear to you that I'm not insane. I never tell anyone about this because it sounds psychotic, I know that, but if anyone here has any ideas as to what she is, then please do let me know. I've never been able to figure out what she was, and it still bothers me a lot, and I would really, really like to know. This is a story about an old barn that my dad was thinking about buying one time. The location was up in northeastern Montana. The barn had been a part of an old ranch at one time, but the rest of the homestead had been destroyed or otherwise dismantled. So the barn was really the only building left standing on a nice flat piece of ground, perfect for renovation for an indoor workspace, storage, vehicles, or gear or something like that. Anyway, I went up with my dad when we went to walk through the place and take a look at the interior, and it was immaculate inside. The barn had 4 or 5 center stanchions about 10 feet apart down the middle of the barn from the floor to the roof. The place was quite sturdy because of this as well. The owner of the land had cleaned this barn up and kept it pretty nice inside for his personal use, and had put down a layer of gravel inside the barn over the original dirt floor in order to keep dust to a minimum. Dad had bought one of those wind-up cameras from the store where you could sort of wind the wheel and snap like 15 photos or something, and have the photos developed at Walmart. So Dad took a bunch of photos of the interior and the exterior of the barn so that he could show Mum the building once he got them developed. He got the photos back from Walmart about a week later, brought them home, and we looked through them as a family around the supper table that night in our kitchen. All the photos were normal, except for one. It was of the interior, taken from the inside, the front door, a few paces in, I would guess. And in this particular photo, the barn was a complete mess. Nothing like it had been when we were there, just hay everywhere, falling from the hayloft, and no gravel covering the dirt floor or anything. When we pulled this photo out from the stack, we were kind of confused and thought that maybe we had gotten somebody else's photo in our group of photos, but it was clearly the same barn. The thing that stood out to our family about this photo of the interior of this barn was, on the first center stanchion there was a silhouette of a man, but with no head, and footprints on the dirt floor leading in, but not out of the barn, stopping at the first stanchion. Dad and I went back up to northeastern Montana later that year in the fall to do some hunting, so we went and spoke to the guy who owned this barn, showed him our photos, and the weird photo as well. When we showed him that photo, his face immediately went pale white, and the look in his eyes was one that I had never seen in another person. He told us that his grandpa had been murdered when he was a small kid, but his parents never told him about what happened, and the murder was never solved. Needless to say, Dad never bought the barn, and the owner, he had it torn down the next year. And it is definitely one of the spookiest things that I've ever been a part of in my life. So there's this place in West Virginia called Lake Shawnee Amusement Park, and it's got one of the creepiest backstories that I've ever heard. It's been abandoned since the 80s, but people still talk about the weird stuff that happens there. The land it sits on has a violent past. Back in 1785, a settler named Mitchell Clay lost 3 of his kids. 2 were killed by Native Americans, and the 3rd was captured and burned at the stake. Clay and some others retaliated by killing several Native Americans. And so yeah, not exactly a peaceful ground to build on. Well, fast forward to 1926, when a guy named Conley Snitto decided to open an amusement park there. It had all the usual stuff: a Ferris wheel, a swing ride, even a swimming pool. But accidents started piling up. 2 kids drowned in the pool, and in 1966, a little girl died on the swing ride after a delivery truck backed into it. The park eventually shut down in 1967 after failing a health inspection. In the 80s, a former employee named Gaylord White bought the land and tried to reopen the park, but after just 1 season, it closed again. Insurance costs were too high. Then things got even weirder. White's crew started digging for a new attraction and found Native American artifacts and human remains. Archaeologists eventually uncovered 13 skeletons, mostly kids. Now, people say the place is haunted. Visitors report hearing children's laughter when nobody's around, and some have seen apparitions near the old rides. The swing ride where the girl died is still standing, rusted and motionless, but some swear that they've seen it move on its own. The park has been featured on a bunch of ghost hunting shows. They all say the same thing. There's just something not right about that place. And so if you're into haunted spots, Lake Shawnee is open for guided tours during Halloween season. Just don't take anything from the site. People who have pocketed souvenirs have reported bad luck until they return them, apparently. The creepiest part, though, in my opinion, some say that the spirits of those buried there, that they've never left. So this happened when I was in the 10th grade. My class went to the state fair for an agricultural show. The class was pretty small and the teacher was kind of doing his own thing. He told us that we should all meet up at a certain location at a certain time. Me and 2 other classmates, I cannot even remember who they are now, just started to enjoy the fair and hit some rides. Now, I'm not personally into fairs really, cheap rides and carnival games, so I was just in a sort of blah mood, I guess, but this girl bumps into me eventually while we were standing in line. We both apologized and chuckled about it. She was my age, looked that way anyway. She also looked nice and quite pretty. She seemed into me and was very handsy as well. She never asked to tag along with us, but just naturally did. I never even questioned it because she was hot and I was interested in the girl. But here's where it gets a bit weird. Looking back, I see a lot of red flags too, but in the moment it was awesome for me. So we went on this dark ride that was supposed to be scary. You know, the ride where you ride in a moving seat into a crazy looking clown head sort of thing. She snuggles up and says that she's scared. And well, after about 10 seconds of grabbing my arm, she reaches down to grab me by my you-know-what. She's given me an over-the-pants you-know-what. And well, the ride ends, nothing happened with me. No release, if you will. And now she's hanging onto my arm while we walk the fairgrounds. She's giddy, I'm happy. She starts telling me how she's from Hawaii and they used to have fires on the beach and play music on a guitar and how she misses it. Well, she says let's go somewhere. Sure thing, I say. Whatever you say. She proceeds to take me to the section of campers where all the carnies live after work. She takes me to this specific spot where 3 campers were in the shape of a triangle and we were in the center. She pulls me close to her body and starts making out with me like a mad person. Keep in mind too that I've barely done anything like this. I was scared out of my mind of getting caught, in fact. But she keeps my attention to her because I was sort of looking around. She asked if I wanted to go inside. I said, inside where? And she said, that camper, and pointed to a really crusty looking camper. And I was about to say sure, and then a security guard caught us and made us leave the area. She bolted and I went back to my friends. I didn't see her the rest of the time that we were there, which was at least another couple of hours, and I was keeping a keen eye out for her. Now, I have thoughts about what was in that camper, what would have happened to me. Was she a prostitute? Was she a ploy to get me inside, and they would lock me in a box just big enough to live until I was transported? Would I have been in the sex industry the rest of my life? I have trauma and nightmares from this, in fact, and while it may have just been me overthinking things, maybe she really did just want to hook up. But something tells me that I think that I definitely dodged a bullet. In high school during COVID time, 2 of my friends and I were laying in my bed watching TV and ended up falling asleep at some stage. I was on one edge, friend in the middle, other friend on the other edge. I woke up to the feeling of water dripping on my face. I wiped it off and turned to my friends, both still sleeping, and woke them up and asked if they were trying to mess with me. They said no and didn't know what I was talking about. The friend in the middle realized that she also was wet, but it was her shirt instead. It had about a palm-sized watermark. We looked around wondering where the water could be coming from. There was a glass sitting above us on the headboard, but it was empty and sitting upright, untouched. They swore up and down that they didn't do it though, and we were all pretty freaked out by it. I begged them to stay the night because I was scared, but in the end they had to leave. Now later that night I was laying in bed and I could hear something rolling around on the floor underneath me. I was confused by it because the day before I had vacuumed under my bed and knew nothing was down there. I ended up going to sleep, and the next morning I woke up to find Tootsie Fruit chew wrappers under my bed, which I don't like and definitely didn't have in my room. Same day, still very freaked out, I was on TikTok and my sister had sent me this really creepy video of this demonic-looking face with eerie music playing. I messaged her and asked why she would send me this because it was so creepy looking, and I was already on edge. And she told me that she had no idea what I was talking about, and went and checked. I messaged back saying that she never actually sent that video before and didn't send it. It freaked us both out, and we were telling our family about it at dinner and went to show them the video, and it had disappeared from our message thread. Then, I think the next day or a couple of days later, I went to a gas station and was buying a Powerade and a snack. When I went to check out, the cashier asked me if I wanted to grab another Powerade or something. I asked if there was a deal going on, and she just flipped the screen and showed me the total was $6.66. So, naturally, I bought another Powerade. I ended up going to a native store that sells sage. The man who owned it blessed me with sage and prayed, and sent me home with more to burn in my house. And, thankfully, nothing else happened after that. But I've always wondered if it was just some really random or crazy sort of coincidences, or if there was something more to it. The incident with the water definitely freaked me out the most, mainly because other people were there and obviously we could actually see the marks. The other stuff, maybe it was just some convenient timing or something, but still, it was a really weird experience and something that I just still don't have any answers for. Recently, I've gone down a rabbit hole of spooky things and figured that maybe it would be worth talking about my own odd experience here. I don't really talk about it in my own life with people that I know personally because it makes my skin crawl and it's weird. But I thought that I would share it here just in case someone might know something. So when I was younger, I had a lot of issues with sleep. I don't remember a whole lot of my childhood, but I know that I wouldn't sleep for long periods of time, frequently bothered my parents in the middle of the night, in fact, had reoccurring nightmare terrors, and would even talk in my sleep. I freaked my dad out many times when I'd get up and wait for him to finish whatever he was doing to talk. A 6-year-old girl in a nightgown with long hair hanging over her face was a freaky thing to see at 2 a.m. Anyways, from as far back as I can remember, until I was about 8 years old, so roughly 3 or 4 years I think, I had the same dream every single night. My bed was right under a window, and I liked to sleep with the curtains partially open so I could look at the moon. It was a 1-story house and my bedroom was at the front. And every single night, and I'm not exaggerating, I truly mean every single night, I would dream that I woke up to see a humanoid creature outside of my window. It was extremely tall, tall enough that I could see most of its body framed by the window. It had like greyish, yellowy skin and wore no clothes. Its shoulders reached the very top of my window, and its torso was nearly the whole length of the window, and I could see the tops of its legs toward the bottom. It had its hands pressed into the glass and its fingers splayed out. But then, the real freaky part. Its neck reached above the window and then sort of looped back down so that its head was visible to the side of its body. It had no hair, massive grey-white eyes, 2 slits for a nose, and a giant grin on its face. And I mean giant. It stretched its skin out on its cheeks and chin, and teeth were so long and jagged and thin, and they were like a dirty yellow sort of colour. It never did anything, mind you. Didn't even blink and just stood there staring at me until I'd wake up in a panic. So, like I said, I saw this creature every night for years. I never told my parents about it. I tried shutting my curtains when I went to bed, but when the dream started, my curtains would be inexplicably open. And then when I woke up, they'd also be partially open, as if I'd never even closed them. Eventually, I told my grandma about the dream when I slept over at her house, and I didn't have the dream for the first time in years after that. And she gave me this tiny clay figurine and told me to sleep with it by my bedside, and that I would never have that dream again. I did as she said, and inexplicably, I never did see the creature again. I still had night terrors and recurring nightmares, but that specific creature just never visited me again. I'm 23 now, and I still sleep with the figurine at my bedside. I've never seen that thing again ever since then, and I'm an insomniac and have experienced sleep paralysis a number of times in my adulthood, frequently experienced night terrors, and have been prescribed a number of sleep medications that I never end up taking long term because of the side effects. At this point, I'm very good at running on little to no sleep, and I have experienced hallucinations during sleep paralysis where I've seen horrible things and had dreams that have left me messed up for days. Still though, I've never seen that creature again. The memory of those dreams is the clearest memory of my childhood that I have. I can remember exactly how it looked, exactly how it felt to lay in my bed and stare at it between my purple curtains, exactly how silent and still it was. And because of this, I don't ever open my blinds at night. I don't particularly believe in the supernatural or anything. I take a firm, it's probably not real, but just in case it is, I'm not going to mess with it, stance on any of that stuff. I hear paranormal stories and immediately consider all the regular things like sleep deprivation and carbon monoxide poisoning before I ever assume ghosts. I've never experienced anything paranormal in my life, aside from what I've outlined here, and I truly believe 100%, however, that this was not a natural thing that happened. I could forgive it as a reoccurring dream or childhood nightmare, but it happened too regularly and far too frequently to think that. I don't know what it was or why, but I really don't think that it was something normal or easily explained, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. And so, that's my story. Like I said, I really don't talk about it too much. I try not to think about it, in fact, but maybe sharing it out here will be beneficial. So if you've listened this far, then thanks for listening. This all started when I was about 10 years old. We moved into a large brick house that did have a kind of creepy vibe, I guess, with old chandeliers, dark staircases, and long hallways and all that. But it all started small. Lights turning on and off randomly, radios turning on in the middle of the night, things like that at first. Quite honestly, too, I just sort of explained it all away. I'm really not sure how, but I didn't think too much of it at first. But things really started to shift when I started having really, really bad nightmares. Nightmares no child should be having. I was 12 by this time, and I didn't consume any frightening material as I was a really sensitive kid that loved plants and animals. I started waking up from nightmares around 3 usually, and just having these insane feelings of dread and terror. Not just from the dream, but I thought that didn't help, but by a palpable feeling in the air, I guess. I would then hear footsteps walking down the hallway and stop in front of my door. Then my door would creak open, and though I couldn't see anything, I was frozen in fear. I could never forget that feeling, too, that something was in the room with me, just watching me. By this time, I'd actually developed a fear of sleeping, and I developed a stutter as well. I really thought that something was psychologically going on with me, and so I finally got up the courage to tell my mum, and I didn't understand what was happening, so I told her that I needed to see a psychologist. She asked me why, and I told her that something was upstairs at night. And she looked at me in this weird way, raised her eyebrows, and never brought it up again. This was in the 90s, so no one talked about this stuff. But after that, I assumed that I was alone in this experience. That's how it started, but then it got more violent. I started having dreams about a dark figure with red eyes hovering over me when I slept. It was a horrible feeling, same as in real life. I would try to say the word Jesus in the dream, as I had heard saying his name could dispel something evil. In the dream, the figure would reach out and grab me by my neck and choke me so that I couldn't say a word. I would wake up gasping for air, and then the paranormal activity would ensue. I even heard voices, laughter, and could swear that I saw a figure in the corner of my room. One night when I was avoiding sleeping, I was playing video games with my younger brother, and it was around midnight. He asked what I was still doing up, and I said that I just couldn't sleep. He said, because of the thing that lives up here, and my eyes immediately got so wide. We were not a sharing, emotional, or talkative family, so this piece of information changed, well, everything. We began swapping stories, and before I could even describe my dreams, he told me that his friend saw a black figure with red eyes and refused to ever sleep over again. And I knew then that I wasn't crazy at this point. But really, the story just began here. My early teenage years were nearly absorbed by dealing with this thing and trying to understand what it wanted, why it was there, and how to be rid of it. It's a long story, but to summarize, I learned it was some sort of an entity that fed on fear. The more afraid it could make me, the more powerful it seemed to become, and the more frequently things would happen. I had to teach myself to not be afraid of it, and that was a whole journey, let me tell you. I needed to believe that I was more powerful than it, and I will never forget this as long as I live. Once I moved in college times as well, I never experienced it again. So my friend Fran and her boyfriend at the time lived in a small, older, 1-floor, 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment about 7 years ago. It wasn't in the best area and the walls were thin, so we could hear the neighbors, each other across the apartment, etc. My friends were struggling for money and got a job offer together to work in another state for a month in December. They didn't want to leave the apartment alone for that time, so they asked another friend, Jude, and myself to house sit for them. We didn't have jobs at the time, and we had spent the night there plenty of times before, so we didn't have a problem doing that for them. Jude and I slept in their bedroom since the secondary bedroom was occupied by Fran's sister, Denise, who was in and out of the house pretty much every day. Basically, she was only there to sleep and was there from about maybe 8 p.m. to 7 a.m. Denise's son, 6 to 7 years old, visited every so often as well and was a sleepwalker or got up in the middle of the night. And so they put up motion sensor lights from the hallway to the bathroom for him. These lights went off all the time, even though it took a person to trigger them. We tested this by tossing small things down the hallway and it never went off. And that was really just the start of it all. Now, the apartment was decorated with Christmas things. They had a tree, bells hanging on the doorknobs, mistletoe hanging in the hallway, stickers on the wall, paper decorations on the coffee tables, and even a little inflatable Santa sitting in a dining room chair. Jude and I were in the living room sitting on the couch on our phones. Behind the couch was a wall sort of connected to the hallway which led to the bedrooms and the bathroom. To the right was the doorway leading to the kitchen and the mudroom, and to the left of the couch was the main entry of the apartment. Now, while we were chilling, we heard a repetitive slapping sort of sound, but just couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. Using my peripheral vision, the mistletoe hanging in the entry above the hallway was swinging very fast, and the longer that I watched it, the more it seemed to slow down. Then it got smacked and landed across the living room. Even though it was winter, we never turned on the heater or the fans or anything, and the way that it got tossed across the room just couldn't have happened from the tape or tack holding it in place. I turned to Jude after that all happened, and he just said, "Yeah, I saw that too." We just picked it off the floor, set it on the table, and I guess we just acted like it didn't even happen. On another occasion, when Jude and I were hanging out in the living room, we watched one of the paper decorations fall off of the coffee table and fall down the Christmas tree. Then we heard a thud in the hallway, and we ignored both things until bedtime. The bedrooms faced each other, and in between them was a blank wall where Fran hung Christmas paintings and all that. The painting was on the floor, but leaning against the wall, and the nail holding it up was still on the wall, so it's not like the nail was loose or anything. We also heard the jingle of bells on the doorknobs jingle on their own as well, and Jude was in the apartment alone for a day when I went home to do some laundry. He was in the kitchen, cooking some ramen on the stove, and felt something swipe his back, he said. When he turned around to see what it was, the inflatable Santa was turned around facing him, and at that he got a really bad feeling. He ditched his noodles and went to his room and went to bed. I never felt this, but both Denise and Jude said that while in the bathroom they felt something swipe or poke their sides, and really I just don't know how to explain it, but I had such anxiety and fear while looking at or into the mudroom that I just still cannot explain what that was. I always focused on a dark spot in there, and I never saw anything happen, but I guess I was always anticipating to see something. With all that said, it never really felt evil or unwelcoming, I guess. Fran had been very stressed dealing with things between her boyfriend and Denise. I know entities feed off of negative energy, so I guess we just sort of chalked it up to that in the end. We told Fran right when she got home, and she told us that she had recently experienced things there too. One being that she saw Denise's boyfriend come out of the hallway and head towards the main entrance. She was about to ask him something, but didn't see him in the living room. And the door hadn't been opened, and he was actually in Denise's room the whole time. And yeah, these are pretty unforgettable things, and something that I guess will just stick with me for as long as I live. So recently, two buddies and I were wandering an abandoned, partially demolished business site. There was a long, narrow warehouse-type structure with a ramp inside about halfway, but we entered at the rear through a doorway. Mostly empty, some boxes and chairs strewn about, but on the right side towards the ramp was a small closet with cans of paint and chemical-like thinners. There was no door to this room, and I went into the closet to take a look. The air was immediately heavy and oppressing, warm even, yet I could feel the hair on my arms standing up. I couldn't move to get out of the closet all of a sudden, and then I started screaming. In my mind, I saw a woman's arms flailing, and my screams were her screams. I heard, "Stop, you're hurting me, get off of me." My friend Mike grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the closet. I then felt fine and calmed down right away. I felt maybe it was the chemicals floating in the air that did something to my brain or whatever. We then all walked down the ramp towards the exit, which was the entire far wall. No door or wall, just open. We're almost at the door when Mike and I stop walking and turn around. Bernie walked a few paces more, then stopped because we stopped. "Are you seeing this?" Mike asked. I was seeing it, but Bernie wasn't. He thought that we were joking around or being stupid, but Mike and I saw something. Slowly floating down the ramp towards us was a black figure. It was the shape of a human shadow with no feet, just the outline. Circling along the floor, up the wall, across the ceiling, down the other wall and along the floor again, just in front of this dark figure, was a bright blue and white light.